If it's in a word or it's in a look, you can't get rid of the Babadook.
Don't you ever raise your voice at me! I am your mother!
Hiya, Georgie. What a nice boat.
What went we out into this wilderness to find?
It's not the house that's haunted. It's your son. Now, sink into the floor.
Wait.
Sink.
Hey, wanna play hide and clap?
Welcome back to the evolution of horror, the last episode of 2019 and the last episode of the decade. My name is Mike and as ever I am your host. Now usually on this podcast we look back at the history and the evolution of the horror genre, in particular subgenres, but we're taking a little break from our usual format. We're not going to be looking at the occult movies of the 1970s this week. Instead we're bringing you a bonus episode in which we look back and celebrate the decade in horror cinema. It's going to be a 2010s best of. So much incredible stuff to cover. I mean, if you go back to the beginning of this decade, everything was very different back then. Gordon Brown was our Prime Minister, Barack Obama was President, and the big horror trends were torture porn, paranormal activity films, and Platinum Dunes remakes. So I think it's fair to say that things have changed a lot since the beginning of the decade, and there's a lot of ground to cover. So this episode will consist of me and my two brilliant guests, Jamie Graham and Rosie Fletcher, discussing the 2010s in depth. We're going to talk about particular trends, particular emerging directors, stars, subgenres that have become really popular, perhaps other subgenres that might have sort of died a death this decade. And we'll then be going through some of our highlights of the decade by giving out certain awards. We'll be doing kind of awards categories like best screenplay, best performance, best kill scene, and we'll all be giving our picks for those. Finally, at the end of the episode, we will finish with listing our top 10 horror movies of the 2010s. Not only that, you'll also hear contributions from various other Evolution of Horror guests and contributors who have sent in messages with their picks, their highlights, and their favourite horror movies of the decade. So much incredible stuff to bring you this week. So let's get straight into it as we bid farewell to a truly phenomenal decade in horror cinema. Rosie Fletcher, hello.
Hello.
Hello, how are you?
Yeah, I'm great, thank you.
Good. And I'm also welcoming Jamie Graham.
Hello.
Oh, this is lovely, isn't it? This is nice.
Whole team back together.
I know, you guys, just briefly, let me ask you guys used to work together, right? At Total Film, is that right?
We did, yeah. We must have known each other for a decade. Easy doors.
Do you know what? I was actually going to ask this, like, what were you guys doing a decade ago? You know, back in 2010. What were you up to?
Gosh, what was I up to? I think I must have just joined.
Yeah, I reckon you just joined because you were at DVD Review.
I was at DVD Review before that.
They literally worked across the floor from us, and I was deputy editor at Total Film. And I can remember chatting to Rosie. I think you actually approached me because you're a much more personable person than I am. And I was at the water cooler and Rosie just got chatting and she was wonderful and so knowledgeable, passionate about film, especially horror movies. Oh. So we struck it off immediately.
Do you remember though, we actually had a massive argument about Hostel 2.
Yes.
That was our bonding moment.
That's going to come up tonight.
That is how we became good friends over our massively disparate opinions on Hostel 2.
What were the opinions then? Can I ask?
I actually rate it. I'm by no means saying it's not. When we do our lists of great horror films of the decade, it's not going to be on it. But I do rate it, and I think that Eli Roth does loads of interesting stuff in it tonally, and I prefer it to the first one.
Interesting.
Rosie hates it.
Hard pass. Well, didn't like it at all.
See, I disliked the original Hostel so much that I've never even seen Hostel.
Well, so I quite liked the original Hostel.
Okay.
Although I wasn't. So yeah, the original Hostel, I was doing a little bit of freelance here and there, but wasn't working full time. But Hostel 2, I was definitely on DVD Review. And I remember you gave it 4 stars and I gave it 2.
Yeah,
and I was
that's
like,
Love it. Love
Whereas the original Hostel, I thought the ideas were really interesting, but technically I thought it was terrible or pretty bad. And I think he improved massively as a filmmaker by Hostel 2, and I just love what he did tonally. Like, just take it was really sort of tongue-in-cheek in places and risky, and it wasn't the straight torture porn you expect.
Interesting.
Yeah, but all the gender stuff was... Anyway, let's not even get into it. Super problematic.
Irritating. I mean, that's the thing I hated about Hostel 1 is irritating. I wanted them all to be tortured.
Oh,
and
I
killed.
did.
And I know that is kind of the point of it as well. I know. Yeah. Actually, maybe that is a kind of good place to start as well, because I was going to ask you guys, you know, horror, how much it's changed sort of generally speaking over the last 10 years, and what was the state of, what was the horror genre like back then, sort of 10 years ago?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a good lead-in. If you're thinking about like 2000 to 2009, this is like an era where we had J-horror was massive.
Yeah.
Loads of J-horror all over the place. Which was quite sort of female-driven and not gory. And I'm a big fan of J-horror. Yeah. Because we did the
We did.
But then, of course, next to that, you had the massive sort of outbreak, is that the right word? Of torture porn.
Yeah, so torture porn was massive at that time, and you had the Saw franchise and you had the Hostel franchise and nasty little movies, Captivity. They were really quite nasty. I can remember one year at Fright Fest, I think it was 2007, because it was 2 or 3 years after those first torture porn films hit, like Saw and the original Hostel. It was a year where everything was torture porn, and loads of people had a go at the Fright Fest guys, and it wasn't really their fault because they can only program what's out there,
what's being made.
But they're so cheap to make, they're easy to make, and everyone was trying torture porn thinking this is going to be the big hit.
God.
And then I guess like you had the whole new new French Extremity, which was a much more sophisticated, interesting kind of take on that. So of course it had a lot of violence, ultra violence, and a lot of torture, but it also had a lot of
quality,
quality and ideas. And
it felt like it had a bit more to say, didn't it, than some of the torture porn films.
Well, Martyrs was kind of anti-torture porn. That's how the director always sold it. He always said it's an anti-torture porn, which I think that stands out. I think again, Rosie and I slightly disagree on this one, but I think it's a wonderful film. There was Inside, there was Frontiers.
I like Martyrs. I just think it's a film of two halves.
The
Frontiers is great, and Switchblade Romance, of course.
Yeah, which was wonderful.
Amazing.
And then also the previous decade, so 2000 to 2009, is when it was like absolute craze for remaking stuff. Just remake-a-rama to the point where it was just unbearable.
I think that's how I almost remember the last decade, actually, is when we got all of the Platinum Dunes movies and all of that crap.
It all started,
it was exhausting.
It all started with Dawn of the Dead, which was actually quite a decent Zack Snyder's remake with sort of fast zombies, and that was decent. But then you had Friday the 13th, The Fog, The Hitcher, you know, a Texas Chainsaw Massacre, all the kind of heritage titles got the remake treatment.
Last House on the Left.
Yeah.
Awful.
And they were all, with exception of 1 or 2, which were okay. They were all bloody awful. Absolutely terrible.
What were your thoughts on Rob Zombie's Halloween? What did you guys think of that? Because that really divides the horror kind of community, doesn't it?
I'm actually a fan to a degree. I think it's obviously a very, very different prospect to John Carpenter's Halloween, which is why a lot of people hate it, and I can see that. But it's sort of, you know, a bit more social realism in a way, like trying to say, oh, this is how he's made Michael Myers, and it's a lot more brutal and in your face. I actually really like his Halloween 2, which is really stylized and it's really violent, so the exact opposite of the original Halloween, which is all suspense and shadows and suggestion. But I really liked it, but I could see why people hate it.
So overall, like, I know, again, it's difficult to kind of generalise over a whole decade, but would you say that this decade has been stronger for horror than the previous?
I mean, it's a difficult one, but if I had to call it, I'd say yes.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think in the last decade, there was some great horror movies, like Let the Right One In was the one that everyone agreed on was great, and then the hardcore horror community like Martyrs, well, you know, the broadsheet critics didn't, but there were some great horror movies, and there was a lot of horror movies right on the periphery of the genre, like Dead Man's Shoes, Even There Will Be Blood, you know, there's movies like that. Are they horror, aren't they horror? Mulholland Drive, and they were some of the best films, horror or otherwise, of the decade, you know, absolutely wonderful. But if you're looking in terms of a decade in the scope, the breadth, the depth of horror movies, I think this decade, whether it's because they're streaming or whatever, we're going to it, you know, more platforms, but I think it goes so deep. It's such a quality decade.
I actually think I mean, I'm sure we'll get into this later, but it feels like this decade has been really good for the genre in the sense that I think it's being taken more seriously, and there are going to be some key examples that I think we're both going to want to talk about, so no spoilers, but totally. But I'm loving that. As a horror fan, I'm really enjoying seeing our beloved genre being taken seriously and being allowed the kind of space that it deserves.
It is. It's the first. I mean, like you, Rosie, I'm sure, but I've been a horror fan since like the mid '80s when I was a teenager, and it's always been a dirty little secret. Whenever I say I love horror movies, people have always looked down on it. And this decade, certainly the last 5 years, it's been the first time it's ever been sort of openly accepted, where people no longer look at me like I'm a serial killer when I say I love horror movies.
Yeah,
and actually, like
totally.
in a weird way, like as a female who loves horror and has done for many years, but I'm not particularly obsessed with the sort of 70s, 80s B movies.
Yeah.
Certainly in the last decade, you'd feel as a female horror critic, it's constantly people going, "Oh yeah, but have you seen Halloween 13? And it's like, well, no, I haven't seen every single one of the Friday the 13th films.
No.
I haven't seen every one of the Nightmare on Elm Street films, but please can we move on and talk about something else? But now
Life's
it
too
feels
short.
like, we can move on and talk about something else, actually.
Totally.
So sorry if I haven't seen everything from the 80s, but there's a load of really interesting stuff to talk about now.
There's so much more
Really
interesting.
are.
I would say, again, it's very general, isn't it? But I would say it's been a much stronger decade. And it does seem to be that a lot of those franchises that were so constantly being resurrected in the last decade, we haven't had, for example, I realised, a Friday the 13th this entire decade.
No, but it was teased, wasn't it? Like,
it was.
They kept saying they were going to do it. And
have you missed it? I mean, have you missed Jason this decade?
oh God, no! No, I was so pleased. I was so pleased that it didn't happen. I was thinking, no.
Yeah.
I grew up on Jason and Freddy. We had a Nightmare on Elm Street right at the start of the decade.
Yeah.
It was awful. One of the worst horror remakes.
We can agree on that one.
It was almost like that was the nail in the coffin for big franchises.
It really
It's like,
was.
That's it, new decade, let's get rid of these.
But yeah, like I said, I grew up with Jason and I loved seeing Jason movies, but I haven't missed him at all because, there's so much better, more interesting stuff out there.
There really is. And it's funny, like you said, the kind of the mainstream and kind of critical, like the critical appreciation of horror. And I was looking back at I was trying to remind myself of this decade, and I looked back at 2010, and obviously you had movies like Black Swan, which ended up getting nominated for Oscars. It won, didn't it? Did Natalie Portman win an Oscar?
She won Best
did.
Actress.
Yeah, amazing. And that is essentially that's a horror movie, right?
Yeah,
which
and
is
it's
another
almost
one people don't say it's a horror movie.
I know.
It's like they used to say these films were thrillers. When it was a Silence of the Lambs or a Black Swan, and people didn't want to accept it as a horror movie. They said, "Oh, it's a psychological thriller." Now they call it an elevated horror movie, which we'll get onto later. But
I think that's been a big trend this decade.
Well,
right?
absolutely. So it used to, you're absolutely right. And I think part of it is moving away from those remakes, actually, because when people say to you, I don't know whether you find this, Jamie, but like, it's not so true anymore, but they say, "Oh, I don't like horror because I don't like Wrong Turn 3." And it's like, why would you judge a genre by the worst of it?
Yes.
Sorry to the makers of Wrong Turn 3. I'm not saying that's literally the worst, but like, you wouldn't go, "I don't like comedy because Bride Wars is bad." Like that just wouldn't be a thing. And these days, I think people have stopped making horror synonymous with slashers and understand that it can be a million different things.
I think that's true. I think it's finally actually escaped not that I think slashers are a bad kind of thing, but I think it's escaped that box of Friday the 13th part 8 and 9 and whatever.
People thought horror movies were teenagers getting killed with big knives again and again and again. Whereas horror movies, Rosie and I have talked about this endlessly in our past, but it's stuff like Jaws, it's Alien, it's all these films that everyone loves.
Yeah.
But if you say, "Oh, you love Jaws, that's a horror movie," they go, "No, it's not. What the hell are you on about?"
I hate horror. Oh, what do you think about The Shining? Yeah, it's brilliant. Right.
Yeah, exactly. So what would you say have been like the overall kind of like trends that you've noticed, or kind of subgenres maybe? Like we said last decade, it was very much kind of torture porn, J-horror, found footage, that kind of thing. Are there any sort of trends that you've noticed this decade?
When we were talking about remakes and sequels, I think that's an interesting trend, the way that's changed. So we've talked a bit about how we're not being flooded.
Yeah.
And there have been some remakes this decade. I mean, they've all been fairly 3-star, I would argue, like Carrie, Poltergeist,
like
not great, but sort of pushed into the background. But more recently, we've actually had some quite interesting reboots and remakes.
We have.
Which is going to be very interesting next decade. So I'm thinking about Suspiria and about Halloween reboot, which I was personally a big fan of.
Yes.
And also news that Jordan Peele is going to be remaking Candyman.
Oh my God,
so could it be possible that remakes are getting a new lease of life,
Yeah.
and a bit more respect.
And you're so right, literally in the last year or two almost, because also, not necessarily remakes, but kind of continuing these kind of well-known properties. So obviously Stephen King, It, and Dr. Sleep, and these kind of these well-known properties have started coming back to the fore in quite interesting ways in the last couple of years, haven't they? But it doesn't seem like the big franchises have dominated the decade so much, I suppose.
No, not so much, because even what we think of as the big horror franchises this decade are stuff like The Conjuring, and its universe.
Yeah.
And these are movies, making 268 million, like The Nun made something like 365 million worldwide at the box office.
Unbelievable.
But they're all movies that are made, they're not big mainstream studio horror movies. They're made for peanuts, under 5 million, most of them. And
they're like our version of the MCU, right?
Yeah, but actually, the Conjuring universe is more expensive than that, actually. So it's although I think The Nun was something like that, wasn't it? But so I think that is a really interesting thing, the Conjuring universe. There's been 7 movies, although you wouldn't notice it because it's not Conjuring 7. Conjuring 3 is coming next year, but they've sort of stealthily created this universe. That actually they are sort of treating like the MCU, which is kind of amazing.
They really are.
Right, it's 9:18. We're headed down into the cellar where the door's just opened on its own. Give us a sign that you want to communicate with us.
Nothing.
What are you guys?
Well, we've been called ghost hunters, paranormal researchers.
But we prefer to be known simply as Ed and Lorraine Warren.
And I think that has been our closest thing to our big franchise of this decade, right? Because we had obviously the Saw, the millions of Saw movies last decade, and we had the Paranormal Activity movies, which did kind of bleed into this decade. But I guess if you're thinking of the big money-making studio properties, it is those, right? It's the Conjuring movies.
Yeah, and then you start to think not as big, but Sinister, Insidious. There's a franchise out there, but they're Blumhouse movies. They're made for that Blumhouse model. Low budget, big returns.
And I mean, Blumhouse, I think, is worth a conversation in itself.
Let's talk about Blumhouse.
He's such a fascinating guy. I mean, I have to say I'm a fan.
Yeah, me too.
His model being, or it certainly was, and I know there's been exceptions because I believe that Us had a slightly larger budget, but it was under 5 million. No first-time directors unless there is a well-known producer attached to it.
Right.
Never with a mind to sequels, so always just make the film for the film's sake, and make it scary. And he's had incredible success. And I'm not saying that every single Blumhouse movie has been gold, but my God, he's got a good hit rate.
An amazing hit rate.
He's had The Purge as well, the Purge movies, which is another franchise.
It's been an amazing... That's been, I think, the first time I've noticed, at least in my lifetime, this idea of a studio having a reputation. Like a kind of like what people used to say about, whatever, the MGM or the Universal Monster movies or whatever, or Hammer, exactly. That is, that's back in a way with Blumhouse, isn't it? It's almost like a Blumhouse is a stamp of approval sort of thing.
But when the news broke that Blumhouse was stepping in to take over the Halloween franchise, you know, all the horror fans and even people who maybe aren't horror fans but just know a little bit about cinema, everyone was excited because it's like I just said, I like the Rob Zombie Halloween movies. A lot of people didn't, but everyone was excited. Like Blumhouse are going to do it. They will make it scary. They will do it right. They'll do it with knowledge, affection for the genre. Because those remakes we talked about earlier, all the stuff like The Fog, Nightmare on Elm Street, they were all made by people who did not know and love the genre. You could just tell that they did not have that understanding. It was just a license to print money, and that was it to them.
And that's an interesting point. So I think that's partly why the Conjuring universe has been so successful, because it's had, so although it's Warner Brothers, great, but it's James Wan. So James Wan made both Conjuring movies, and there were points where, of course, it didn't work so well. So the first Annabelle, I honestly think, is one of the biggest pieces of crap.
It's awful. The first
terrible. Right? Awful. But the second
one's great.
Pretty great, isn't it?
Yeah.
And actually makes more sense of the first one because it's a prequel to a prequel.
Yeah.
And although I thought The Nun was awful, and I thought La Llorona was pretty bad, and I didn't mind Annabelle 3. I
liked it.
I've not seen that yet. Is it worth a watch?
I actually thought it got a hard deal from critics. I really enjoyed it.
Interesting.
I think it's sort of a Ghost Train movie, isn't it? Really? sort of one crazy night.
It's really, scary. It is scary.
And that is the thing. With those movies, the best of them are just like you're going to go sit in the cinema and just be really scared.
Which is what a lot of people want from a horror movie.
Yeah.
I have this conversation a lot of the times because it's one of the last things I look for in a horror movie is being scared. Right. I'm more interested in ideas and mood and all stuff like that. But most people, if you say to the average man or woman on the street, you're going out on a Friday night with your friends, you're going to put your money on the box office, you're going to watch a horror film, what do you want? They want that ghost train. They want to be scared and come out sort of giggling and talking about it. And you know.
And that's why those ones have made all the money, isn't it?
Totally.
I suppose it makes sense.
Yeah.
And I find myself, I'm so used now to looking for those. I'm the same as you, Jamie, and I love all the kind of, and we'll get onto them, you know, the kind of A24 ones and all these other. And I sat down and I watched Annabelle Comes Home. No, the second Annabelle Creation. I saw it. I came to it really late, and I saw it last year, and I watched it at home, and I was like, right, okay, very kind of cynical, like, this is going to be everything I've seen before, and I found myself going, oh fuck, I'm really, really scared, almost getting angry at it because you know she's sitting on that stair lift going up really slowly, and I'm like, for fuck, I know this is going to make me jump, but it's great for that. It's great for that
experience. Proper classical horror. It's just sort of moving the camera really slowly and elegantly, taking a lot of time with characters, building suspense. It's wonderful.
Yeah. Oh, and I'm sorry to bang on about gender, but I'm going to.
No,
but another interesting thing about the Conjuring universe is that, and actually a thing that you see in Sinister and Insidious as well, is this kind of domestic horror. So it isn't like the previous decade or like the 80s or whatever, like serial killers chasing ladies in not very many clothes and people being punished for having sex. It's not skewed male. And actually, I can't remember what the stats were, but so The Conjuring, when it came out, was the highest opening weekend box office for an original horror at that time. And it skewed more female than male. There were more women that went to see that film than the men did.
Fantastic.
And it's about a happily married couple. And then that film is about a woman. So it's a female ghost and a woman with 5 daughters. It's like super female.
That's right.
And all of those films, they're just not. So it's not that it's only interesting to women. It's interesting to both genders, of course, but like that whole franchise it's just not gendered in the same way that horror used to be.
It's really interesting. I mean, to go back to the Fright Fest guys, I always ask them every year for a sort of breakdown of their audiences because I find it fascinating. And they don't give exact figures, but they promised me this year it was pretty much a 50-50 split, male, female. And I was watching, of the 74 films, I managed to watch about 70 of them on links and at the cinemas.
Amazing.
And thank you. And it was amazing that even though I think it was only 8 of the 74 were directed by women, which is still more than it used to be in the 80s and 90s, we're getting there very, very, very slowly. But the amount of stories that were female-centric, and not just in that Dario Argento way of like, oh, it's best to kill attractive women, that's what gets me off. It was proper, like, female characters, where they were the heart of a story. And it was just really great to see. And I think it has really kind of become more diverse.
I think that's changed definitely this decade, hasn't it? Like, I think people will remember people like Toni Collette in Hereditary and Jennifer Kent's The Babadook, and these movies are what are going to stick out in the mind. These kind of much more kind of female stories, aren't they, in a way, I suppose. Now, before we get into the next topic I want to bring up, here's a little voicemail from a friend of the podcast, Louise Blaine, with some of her picks of her favourite horror movies of the 2010s. Here we go.
Hi Mike, and Merry Christmas to you and everyone who listens to the Evolution of Horror podcast. Thank you for thinking of me to talk about my horror movies of the decade, which feels like some kind of cruel quiz where you have to make me pick between which one of my fingers I'd like to lose, like a saw trap. But obviously The Witch, it's amazing. We talked about it on the podcast. It's incredible. That's there. Hereditary, because I'm still terrified. I still think about the end of that movie. It still sneaks into my head when I turn off the light, which makes it amazing. The Cabin in the Woods. I mean, I don't even really know how many you're letting me have, but The Cabin in the Woods is amazing, and obviously that. Get Out, because yes, Jordan Peele and incredible, and everyone that says that it's not a horror movie, of course it's a horror movie. You just don't like the fact that it's a horror movie because it's so good and you don't want to let us have fun. Also, It Follows, so good. That Disaster Piece soundtrack, those amazing scares, genuinely amazing. The Conjuring, obviously, as I've talked about with you, James Wan is amazing. Obviously not so much The Conjuring 2, we just won't really talk about that. When it comes to my surprise movie of the decade, I'm going to continue to say Hell House LLC, which again is still one of the scariest found footage movies that I think I've ever experienced, just for how much it surprised me. So yes, Hell House LLC is absolutely one of my horror movies of the decade. But yeah, that's my lot. I've probably missed out about 1 million, but that's the way it works. So thanks again, and happy Christmas and a lovely new year when it comes.
Thanks, Louise. Always lovely to hear from Louise. And Hell House LLC, still a movie I've not seen, so that's very much on my list. I'm going to have to check that out.
Hey guys, what are you guys doing?
Did you guys buy your tickets 2 weeks ago like I asked you?
No.
Which seats are better, balcony or orchestra?
Hey Mitch, who's your buddy?
Who is that?
I just tried to hang up on him.
Can we get rid of this person?
I don't know. Was this here the whole time?
It's just probably a glitch.
So we've talked about Blumhouse. I want to talk about some of the other kind of big influences, I suppose, on horror in this genre. And I suppose you can't ignore the fact that this has been the dawn or the boom of, things like social media and mobile phones. How much has that affected horror? Has it changed horror for the good or worse? Because you get a lot more horror films now that are about Skype or about text messages or whatever,
I think we haven't yet seen the great sort of social media horror film. I think there's been been a lot of decent ones like Unfriended, Slenderman, Cam. I think they're all decent, but then to me probably the best, which again it played at Fright Fest I think the year before last, I'm not sure if it's come out yet, Tragedy Girls, has that come out yet? Is it
I don't know if it ever got a release, did it? I can't remember,
but that was really good. The idea behind it was there's these two girls who have an online TV show where they report real life crime, and in order to get their numbers up and their hashtags and their hits and all that, they start basically doing these crimes themselves and kicking them off, and it's kind of like a slasher movie but very hip and smart and stylish. I think that's a really good one. And then if you count it as a horror film, going back to what we were saying, films right on the periphery of a genre, Ingrid Goes West, which is obsession, it's kind of mental illness, it's stalking.
Such a good film.
I think that's fantastic, which again, the whole sort of Instagram age. But unless I'm missing any, I think they're the best we've had so far. I'm not sure we've yet had the sort of masterpiece of the genre.
Yeah, I think the difficulty is it moves so quickly, isn't it? Doesn't it? So I remember when Chat Room came out, and I think that was around 2010, and it just felt like 10 years too late. Chat rooms anymore. This is embarrassing. So it's quite difficult to do. I would add to your list though, and it's not quite a social media thing, but it's got an element of that, is Assassination Nation.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's
which
good.
is a very angry film.
Really angry.
I loved it. I thought it was wonderful.
So
although it isn't about social media, it has that element.
It kind of is, isn't it?
Well, it is in the sense. So it's about lots of personal secrets, or half, I think, a school's personal secrets are leaked, and these 4 young women are blamed for it. And it essentially kicks off a class war, a generation war, a gender war. It's basically this utterly kind of fabulous, furious kind of
so good,
very current movie. And
it almost could work as a Purge origin story. Better than the actual Purge origin.
It's the movie that the Purge wishes it was, quite frankly. I mean, the Purge is a bit of fun, and I came out of Assassination Nation absolutely exhausted and kind of a bit tearful. There were a couple of scenes in it which, that scene. Anyway,
it's
spoilers,
terrifying and
particularly
grueling.
Kind of grueling scene. But I mean, it's a great movie.
It really
is a great movie. I came out really hyped up, actually. I kind of I could see what you're saying, exhausting, but I came out almost with the wrong thing, that I wanted to just go out on a mission of vengeance myself. But maybe that says more about me.
No, but that's a great thing, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Because the key image is about those 4 young women, and then
striking back.
Of people behind them.
So good.
It's such a massive fuck you, that film. Right?
Yeah.
And actually, then that should probably take us on to another big thing, is that how much has politics played in? I guess politics has always played into horror, right? But has it played into it more this decade, would you say?
Well, I would say it's kind of at its height, but it has been for a few years. I think obviously in the 50s you had the whole sort of, Cold War stuff going on with all the monster movies and all that. In the 70s, horror genre, the American horror movies and nightmare movies of the 70s were very politicised, be it Last House on the Left, Texas Chainsaw, it all fed into that Vietnam, civil rights. All of that, Watergate, there was so much anger and disillusionment. But since then, I don't think horror has been massively politicised. In the 80s, it should have been more with Thatcher and Reagan. You had stuff like Society, which was, but there wasn't loads. Yeah. But I think now, the horror movies right now, is quite a lot of them. Again, at Fright Fest last year, it was interesting that a lot of films there were about kind of the 1%ers, the haves and the have-nots. There was a lot of anger kind of welling up at that. There was a lot of films about kind of toxic masculinity. So those kind of things which are Me Too, like there was a film called Feedback, which is very Me Too, and there was loads of them where it's really sort of plugging into our times. I think it's because right now we're in such a bad place with Brexit and with Trump and all of that. There's so much kind of anger in the world, and there's so much just being scared shitless, really.
Yeah, tension.
But it has to go somewhere, and horror filmmakers, who better than to channel it, you know?
And I think again, we'll get into this later, but I think one of the most interesting upcoming filmmakers of this decade is obviously Jordan Peele, with Get Out and Us, which were both highly political movies in different ways, and talking about very modern politics, talking about things that hadn't really been addressed in horror movies in that way before.
Yeah, Get Out was it felt like a game changer. And of course we had movies like The Purge before that, which were being quite political as well, weren't they? But maybe not doing it quite as well as they could have, whereas Get Out is,
I mean, The Purge is great, but it's just not super nuanced.
Yes.
Which is the opposite of Get Out, which is incredibly nuanced.
Something doesn't feel safe here.
We don't see you for 2 years, and then all of a sudden, we get invited to this lavish dinner. Don't tell me that this is normal.
What about streaming as well? I mean, like, we've seen the dawn of things like Netflix and Amazon Prime, and therefore that you get these movies. I guess what used to be straight-to-video movies back in the 80s and 90s are now straight to streaming. How have you found those kind of films, and how has that kind of impacted horror in general, would you say?
I'd say so. Over the years, so early doors, Netflix was the home of utter crap, basically. Like, particularly in horror, like, you just wouldn't know, and because it's, I guess its rating system or the way it worked meant that it was impossible to tell.
It's hard to navigate Netflix. I still find it hard to navigate Netflix.
Yeah. But Netflix has upped its game, to be fair.
Yeah. Oh my god.
So I mean, like, it used to be that there were thousands of them and they were invariably shite.
Yeah.
But we've had things like The Perfection, which I thought was really interesting.
Wonderful, yeah.
Annihilation, obviously, which was brilliant.
Yeah.
Bird Box didn't work for me,
I didn't like
but it was an interesting project, I think.
Yeah, and I think we all, no matter what we all thought of it, we all watched it. That's the thing, you know. It's like everyone tuned in to see it.
You would, Sandra Bullock.
Yeah.
Then there was Hush, Mike Flanagan, which was terrifying.
And
Gerald's Game.
So I didn't like Gerald's Game.
Didn't you? Oh, I loved it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a bad piece of filmmaking. I think Mike Flanagan's brilliant, but I really hate that book. And so
I don't like that book.
I just couldn't. It's just such a stupid story as far as I'm concerned.
I don't like that book, but I thought the film was a lot better than the book.
The film scared the shit out of me, I've got to say. I'd never read the book and I didn't know anything about it. And the image of the guy stood in the corner of the bedroom that slowly comes into focus scared the shit out of me. I thought it was pretty good.
And of course, Netflix has been absolutely killing it in terms of TV.
Oh,
yeah.
I mean, and that's another big thing this decade, right? TV horror, because I didn't really feel like horror fit with the TV medium before this.
No.
But we've had a load of amazing TV shows, haven't we?
Yeah. I mean, for me, the highlight of all the horror on TV, and there's a lot, but was The Haunting of Hill House, which I think is incredible.
Brilliant, isn't it?
Absolutely. I actually think it's Flanagan's best work, and he's made some great films, but it's just taking that, such an acclaimed seminal novel, turning it completely on its head, doing something new with it, taking it in completely different directions, and doing it over those 10 episodes, which horror doesn't work like that, you know. It doesn't build like that slowly and sort of, you know, he's just done it so cleverly and had me absolutely gripped start to finish. But I think there's been loads of good horror. I mean, if you count it, the first season Stranger Things, I think the next two aren't that great, but that whole sort of Spielberg, Stephen King, John Carpenter vibe, it got so spot on. It was wonderful.
Have you guys checked out Marianne yet?
No.
Holy
my
fuck.
God. I'm about a third of the way into it.
It's really scary. Like, it one of the things I love about it, and actually I think it's true of this decade, because, you know, you talked a bit about how horror wasn't really nailing TV, and I think it's because it was being a bit apologetic. I think American Horror Story came in and was like, we're horror, we're really horror, we're horrible.
Season 2 of American Horror Story, the sort of slightly torture porny one in the asylum.
Oh my God, the whole Chloe Sevigny thing.
Talk about not holding back. That was worse than pretty much any film you ever see.
But Marianne is so unapologetically horror. It's really, really creepy, and it gets worse. And like, there's no, you know, is it real or isn't it? No, it's definitely a witch, and she lives in a hole, and everyone's pulling their teeth out and bags of skin, and it's like really, really quite disturbing.
And I love that. I do feel like as well in this last 10 years, and again, it's talking very generally, but the really scary movies have come back, like movies that aren't necessarily designed to gross you out or shock you or exploit or whatever, but are just like old-fashioned scary films, like Ghost Train. Like we've talked about it already, but Ghost Train movies. I feel like, is there a dominant subgenre from this decade? I feel like it probably is the ghost movie and haunted house movie.
Because I'd say that there's a sort of a slight difference between what I would call a Ghost Train movie and some of the elevated horror. So you talked about Annabelle Comes Home, which I really enjoyed because it's a Ghost Train movie. It's got like a wolf man in it, and it's got loads of jump scares and monsters, and it's creepy. But then you've got movies like obviously Hereditary. And Babadook and The Witch, which are not like that. No. They're harrowing and traumatizing, and they're you feel like you've been crushed, basically. I came out of Hereditary with marks on my arms and like real bad tension in my shoulder. Like,
I remember we all just came out and no one spoke to each other. Everyone was like, let's just go home.
It's heartening to see so many strange new faces here today. I know my mom would be very touched and probably a little suspicious. My mother was a very secretive and private woman.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, the kind of the A24 and this kind of, I guess, what people call now in the press elevated genre. That's kind of dominated the last sort of few years, hasn't it, in horror?
It really has. I mean, A24, their hit rate. They do other movies other than horror, but focusing on their horror, their hit rate is unbelievable. They've got Midsommar, Hereditary, The Witch, Lighthouse, It Comes at Night, Under the Skin, Black Coat's Daughter. It just goes on and on. I think Green Room, Enemy, Killing of a Sacred Deer.
Amazing. What a
incredible.
It's just stunning, and they are. I mean, maybe this is why the horror genre is so accepted now, because nobody can watch those films and dismiss them. There's so much going on.
Yeah, and nobody can say those films aren't horror. I mean, possibly people were saying that Under the Skin wasn't, but I would wholeheartedly disagree.
Yeah, the really irritating thing is some people do try and argue, don't they, that some of those films aren't horror, but they are, and it's just, and they are scary, and like you said, it's a different kind of scary, isn't it? It's like gets under your skin, slow burn kind of scary.
And they're really based in like proper human condition, human emotions, family dynamics, whatever it is. So often they're really terrifying before the horror even comes into it. Hereditary being a good, a perfect case in point, really. But that last half hour, last 20 minutes, it goes bonkers, and I actually like that. Some people don't. But that first hour, it could just be an Ingmar Bergman drama.
And that's the thing, it's unbearable.
Domestic drama.
And you're absolutely right. Some people don't like the ending, and I love it, and I needed it because I just by that point I was like, I can't cope with any more grief. I'm like absolutely crushed by this. And so when everything goes crazy,
so when it goes mad and it's Hail Payman, it's like people floating up to a treehouse. It's like wonderful.
That is it. Some of these films are so horrendously oppressive that like you pray for the kind of genre, like this genre silliness in some way, because it's like thank God,
because I just couldn't cope with any more of it. I mean, like Midsommar, obviously Ari Aster's follow-up starts with that moment of utter horrendous grief, and I was thinking, I can't do this. This is really long. I cannot sit through 2 hours and 25 like this. I can't. And thank goodness it isn't like that. Actually. There's way more lightness in that, but again, it's still oppressive. It's still disturbing as all hell.
Totally. Again, like, do you think that this has been a more so than maybe the previous couple of decades for new voices? Like, we've had Ari Aster, Robert Eggers, Jordan Peele, these people. We sadly lost so many horror legends this decade too, like Toby Hooper and Wes Craven. And it does feel like it's kind of like we're now kind of all of these other names, these new names are kind of household names already, aren't they? Like you go see the new Robert Eggers movie, or you go see the new Jordan Peele movie.
You would. Yeah, there's been a whole wave of them. It's quite bizarre. I mean, also as Ben Wheatley kind of started 2009 with Down Terrace, and he's done other things, other than horror, but he made Kill List, he made Sightseers, he made A Field in England. All of those are horror movies, I'd say. And even like High Rise, I'd say, has got one foot in the genre. So he's another new voice. We don't think of him because he's made so many movies in such a short time.
And he's doing Tomb Raider next.
Which is mad.
And he's so prolific, isn't he?
He
is prolific. Benson and Moorhead, I'd want to mention.
They're amazing.
They're so interesting and so have such a specific style and look.
Yeah.
And actually, that might be one of the things that makes those directors stand out, because although talking about Ben Wheatley, his movies are quite diverse, but there is still a Ben Wheatley.
You know it's Ben Wheatley,
And Benson and Moorhead, absolutely, you can.
Yeah, you're right.
And lots of them, not all of them. I don't think Spring is part of that universe, but certainly Resolution and Endless.
Totally.
Are part of the same thing, but they also have a little bit of an aesthetic and a little bit of a mood.
Totally. It's almost like a kind of auteur horror emerging, isn't it?
I mean, Ari Aster absolutely has that.
Oh my God,
definitely.
Jennifer Kent's an interesting one. Did you guys get a chance to check out the
Nightingale? Love it.
Yeah,
absolutely adored it.
We saw that together, yeah.
Very, very, very different from the Babadook, but still an amazing movie. My God,
brutal. One of the, talking of films that are hard to watch, that one.
Yeah.
I mean, that one scene in particular, which we won't go into, but there's one scene in that which, there was walkouts when I saw it.
But that's the thing, you say that one scene, I'm going, was it this one, or was it the one where that happened, or was it the bit where she had to walk behind and
I'm going to do emotion, Rosie.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
You're all right.
You know it. You know it.
No, yeah, that. Yeah, I think I closed my eyes.
Yeah. Oh, it's just horrendous. But again, I mean, it's not really a horror movie. I'd say, maybe it's more sort of Western revenge story, although there's elements of horror in there. But such a brutal tale.
Yeah.
And the Babadook's wonderful, which again was one of the first movies everyone talks Hereditary, and Hereditary's wonderful. But Babadook, in terms of mental illness and grief and just it's just gut wrenching.
Yeah.
Hi Mike, it's Brad Hanson. My favourite horror films of the decade would have to be 2013's Under the Skin by Jonathan Glazer. Is it a horror film? Is it not? Who knows? But I fucking love it. And 2011's Cabin in the Woods, which a film when I saw in the cinema I was like, this has just been made for me, and I'm sure a lot of other people feel exactly the same. Shout outs to One Cut of the Dead, Hereditary, Midsommar, Get Out, Under the Shadow. There's been some great stuff released in the last decade, and also some fucking shit, which I love to enjoy as well. Anyway, happy Christmas, Merry New Year and all that bullshit. See you later.
Do you think, like, all these films we're talking about, whether it be the big studio ones, the Conjuring movies, and then also these A24 ones, is there still much this decade for the Gore Hounds, for the people that did love Eli Roth and Rob Zombie and those kind of filmmakers? Is there still that? Does that stuff still exist in horror?
Well, I tell you what, this was the decade that launched the Sharknado franchise.
Well, there you go.
Well, we have overlooked one important subgenre, which was massive this decade, which will give you your Gore, which is zombies.
Oh God.
Obviously,
we didn't even talk about The Walking Dead, did we? With
I know,
TV,
Walking Dead, which started 2010, and we kind of forgot it because it's now become so boring and going round in circles. But you forget how amazing those first few seasons were.
Yeah.
Like to see, I can remember watching the first couple of episodes of Walking Dead in 2010, and to see a zombie apocalypse on that scale, it made Romero's Dawn of the Dead look tiny, and it was amazing as a horror fan to see something like that. And just incredible. So you've had a whole, probably because of Walking Dead taking it to the mainstream, but you've had so many zombie movies this decade. I'd argue there's only probably been 3, 4, 5 which are really, really good, but they're just ubiquitous.
Yeah, you're right actually. And speaking of thinking about films like Train to Busan and that kind of thing, I mean, we should talk about maybe some of the films outside of the UK and the US. We talked about how much we love J-horror, Rosie, last decade. Have you noticed any other kind of traditions internationally in horror over the last few years?
I don't know about traditions necessarily, but I think there's been a lot of interesting things going internationally. I mean, you talking about zombies, one of my favourites. My favourite zombie movies is One Cut of the Dead, of course, which is kind of a zombie movie, which is a wonderful thing. If you haven't seen it, massive recommend. So I don't know whether you guys had the same experience, but the first third I'm like, it's all right, what's everyone going on about? Second one I'm like, all right, it's quite innovative, but still. And then the third bit, it's like, oh my God, I love this so much.
It's a film of 3 parts.
It's the film I have to keep saying to people, stick with it. Stick with it.
The third part is so joyful, my God, it's just wonderful.
I actually saw that on a link, because I can't see all the Fright Fest films at Fright Fest because they all double, triple up. So I saw it on a link, and I didn't know anything about it at that point. It hadn't broken, and I just watched that first half, especially like on my TV through the laptop. I was like, this is so cheap and so like average. Like that first third, and then like you said, the second third, I was like, oh, okay, I'm mildly interested now. And the third, I was just like, wow. Yeah. Incredible.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah, and actually, like you said, that, you know, I covered zombie movies, and there are, you know, if you find the good ones, there have been some really fucking good ones in the last few years. That's the thing. There are some gems. I think, go on.
I was going to say, so you were talking about international horror.
Yes.
I wanted to give a shout out to Rabies, which was 2010. Do you remember it?
Israel.
I think I've seen this.
So
it's wonderful.
Sort of like touted as the first Israeli slasher movie.
Yeah, like slasher.
It is, but it's a slasher with a twist. It is really not. It starts off one way, and it is not the film you think it's going to be. And that I thought was a real standout. And they went on and made Big Bad Wolves after that.
Yeah.
And I don't know what.
I don't know if they've done anything.
But that was a really interesting thing to come out of Israel, and it was quite political. And I remember talking to the directors, and I think rabies like is a slang term in Israel for like everything's gone to shit, basically. And that's essentially what that movie kind of does. It's a really smart, really twisty film that I'd super recommend.
That's interesting.
It's really weird that every year at Fright Fest they show these 60, 70 movies, and there's always one sort of on the Discovery screens, a smaller film that catches fire, and everyone's talking about it, and then they have to put it on again and again so everyone can catch up with it, because
One Cut of the Dead, they added like 3 extra screenings.
So One Cut of the Dead was it this year, and 2012 I think it was Rabies. That was the one where everyone was like, oh my god, Rabies, you have to see Rabies.
Yeah, it is. That is really interesting. And you know, I want to ask you, you know, we talked about how ghost movies have become quite a big thing again. Zombie movies, we've had a lot of them. Folk horror seems to have come back.
Yeah, that's been a big time.
Big time,
Maybe Kill List and I don't know, Midsummer and all these movies.
And The Witch, of course,
returned. And I want to ask you, what about slashers? Have slashers officially died? Are they gone?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not really a fan of slashers.
Yeah.
So I was sort of hoping they were going to die. And I think that what we don't have is slasher after slasher after slasher after slasher.
Yeah.
But I think that there are the odd ones here and there.
The odd one.
So like The Final Girls, excellent film.
Yeah.
Twist on the slasher genre. So twist. I mean, as I said before, I actually really liked the Halloween reboot. I thought that was really smart. Sort of slightly a twist on that ish. Better Watch Out. I know that not everyone loved it, but I got on really well with that film.
Better Watch Out. And one of the things I particularly loved about it was released by a studio. I think, was it Universal?
I think it was.
And it's so rare for a big studio to take a movie like that. It's really quite out there in some ways, and like it's really, I thought gender politics was spot on, and it's really smart, and it's quite nasty as well, and they just took a chance on it and they put it out there, and it is wonderful, and you wouldn't expect it from a big studio, that film.
Totally. At the time we're recording this, it's early December, and have either of you guys seen Black Christmas yet?
Not yet.
Christmas. No, I haven't.
I don't think they've shown it yet.
They haven't shown it to anyone yet, have they? What are your thoughts on the new Black Christmas?
Well, it looks like that's going to have a political edge and a bit of a twist. And I love the original Black Christmas. I think
the original was great.
But in the name of maybe this decade remakes being a bit smarter and having their own identity, I'm totally, not having seen it, all for Black Christmas doing something different and moving with the times, and you know, having that political. I think it's a gender politics and a class politics.
I'm totally up for that.
And also the first remake, 10 years ago or whatever it was so bad.
We talked about the bad remakes of the last decade.
It's kind of one of those studio glossy plastic remakes with nothing to it, no soul, and I just hated it. So as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't exist. So for me, you know, it's go back to Bob Clark's early 70s, whatever. It's time to remake it. Let's do it.
Absolutely. And just to finish on that idea then of the kind of franchises, you mentioned it, Rosie, Halloween, and we also had Suspiria last year. Do you like these movies then? I guess they're trying something a bit different, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, Halloween for me, because it's a reboot rather than a remake.
Yeah.
But to me, it really, really worked.
Yeah.
And I think it was faithful, but not slavish to the original, and I think Carpenter's involvement obviously helped. It had moved with the time, so the politics was really, really interesting. The ending I just thought was fantastic. We're going to get 2 more Halloween movies after that, and I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of Suspiria, I'm going to throw that over to you, because I am not a massive fan of Giallo in general, so I don't think I'm really the right person.
Me neither, to be honest. Yeah, and Jamie, we'll be discussing Giallo in a couple of weeks'
we
time.
Will, indeed.
But what did you think of the remake?
I thought it was really good as far as remakes go. Like compared to a lot of the remakes we talked about earlier, it's in a different class. I think it's got its own vision. It's very, very different to Dario Argento's Suspiria. I much prefer Dario Argento's Suspiria, but that's one of my favourite horror movies of all time, as we will discuss in a few weeks. But I thought it was really interesting. It had some crazy moments in it. The last kind of 20 minutes, up until then, it's been quite slow moving, and it's been quite arty, quite sort of proper auteur horror. And then the last 20 minutes, it goes bonkers. It goes
a bit more Argento, actually, doesn't it? Yeah.
It's absolutely crazy. But there was a lot I liked in it. One of the death scenes in it, which we're going to do our awards later, I think. And I actually haven't mentioned it for the best kill, but it's right up there. The scene where she's dancing and kind of everything's going out of place and the bones are clacking and the limbs are splitting is just
unbelievable.
Wonderful. Horrendous and wonderful.
Yeah, agreed.
Hi, Mike. Merry Christmas. It's Becky Dark. This has been tough. Looking back, the 2010s has been good. A Dark Song, Kill List, Resolution in the Endless, The Void, Creep, Cam, Hush, Climax, Raw, The Witch, A Quiet Place, Piercing, Lords of Chaos, Black Swan, Possum, like phenomenal horror movies, one and all. And I know that there are some that I've missed. The best horror movies of the decade for me are Get Out and Hereditary. I find it difficult to choose one over the other. I think they're both phenomenal and important and terrifying and amazing. But my favourite of the decade is Cabin in the Woods. I find it endlessly rewatchable, and you only really need to go back to our episode with Rob Watts to hear all of the reasons why I effusively adore this film. There's a bit of a plug for you, marketing queen that I am. All right, buddy. Love you loads. Merry Christmas, and I'll see you soon.
Hello, Mike. It's Stevie Webb. Feliz Navidad. Please excuse the washing machine in the background. This was really hard, but going back through the decade, bloody hell, there's been some incredible films across so many different subgenres. Some honourable... I have picked one, though, and I think it might be quite unexpected, but some honourable mentions from the decade for me would be Under the Skin, 10 Cloverfield Lane, The Witch, Evil Dead, Hereditary, Cabin in the Woods. Obviously on there we've got some post-horror films. I'm only joking, and I'll headbutt anyone who actually uses that term. But the one I'm picking is right on the cusp of the decade. It's 2010's The Reef by Andrew Traucki. And it's a shark film, technically, a creature feature. And Andrew Traucki also directed Blackwater about the crocodile and The Jungle about leopard horror films. It's honestly one of the most stressful and incredibly tense experiences I've ever had, and it's one of those films that I show other people. I must have watched it at least 10 times. There's something about the mounting tension that I've never felt, and even every time I revisit it, I go through that emotion again. It is so incredibly shot. If you haven't seen it, I can't recommend it enough. It's I'm hoping no one else would have said this, but my favourite horror film of 2010 to 2019 is 2010's The Reef. Watch it and have a fucking brilliant Christmas.
All right. Let's get into it then. So I've asked you guys to kind of we're gonna run through some top 10s at the end, but because I feared that there might be a lot of crossover with top 10s, I thought it might be more fun to kind of ask you guys to pick some of your favourite picks from different sort of categories, awardsy kind of categories, I suppose, but horror ones. So the first thing I want to ask you is, this is a really difficult question, but what has been the scariest film of the 2010s for you each? What's been the film that has scared you the most this decade, Rosie?
Well, am I allowed to have more than one pick, or does it have to be one?
Of course you can. Yeah.
Okay, if
you
it's
better
one,
do, because I've got loads for all of them.
Okay, brilliant.
Me too. So, I've got about 4 for each. But,
yeah. If it were one, it would be Hereditary. Yeah. Honestly, that film affected me so profoundly. I think it's a wonderful film, and it just really properly scared me.
Yeah.
But I want to mention The Innkeepers, and we haven't talked about Ty West, which we totally should have done.
Ty West is great.
Yeah. Although latterly, less so. But The Innkeepers, I think it's just a phenomenal film. I've only seen it twice, and the second time I watched it, I was at home alone, and I got towards the end, and I'm like, nope, know what happens, don't need to see that again. Thanks very much. Because it's so bloody scary.
It's a proper ghost story.
Creepy,
proper ghost story.
So I thought that was a wonderful film. And and I don't know what's going to be on your list, so I'll just have 3. But I want to put Creep out there. Creep is such a weird film, but I really found it quite scary, and it's not a ghost story.
And of course, we're not talking about the Charing Cross monster.
Not monsters on the tube.
Yeah.
Just really, Mark Duplass, really weird guy asking a videographer to make a video of him to give to his son because he apparently is dying. But it isn't that.
Creep 2's creepy as well.
It is, yeah. They both are. I prefer the first one, but because
Blumhouse again. Both Blumhouse
I didn't even
movies.
realise that. But yeah, the first Creep, just I didn't know anything about it.
Yeah, it's really
good. It really creeped me out.
Isn't that one that went straight to streaming?
I think it is. I think that's a Netflix. I think that was a straight to Netflix, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I love that film as well, and I've got a few films coming up in my list that are like that are like basically character pieces, all set in one location or whatever.
So freaking unsettling, that movie.
Yeah, it really is
unsettling, and it's performance led.
I love Duplass, full stop, in everything.
So good, yeah. And actually, just before we get to your pick, Jamie, let me just ask you off the back of that. We haven't really talked about found footage. What's become of found footage this last 10 years? Has that also died a death?
It hasn't totally.
Yeah.
Willow Creek we had this decade.
Yeah. I think the first half of this decade there was a lot of found footage.
Yeah.
It was kind of really rolling over the last 3 or 4 years.
Grave Encounters.
It's definitely falling out. Yeah.
We were in the latter half of the Paranormal Activity still, weren't we?
Yeah, that's right. Paranormal Activities, yeah.
The Borderlands I'm a big fan of.
The Borderlands is good.
Really scared me as well. All right, Jamie, what about you? What's been the movie that scared you most, or the handful of movies that have scared you most?
Well, I'm going to first of all say there's a difference for me between the most disturbing movie and the scariest movie. Disturbing movie, I'd agree with Rosie. I think it's Hereditary. They really got to me and just messed me up.
Yeah.
I also found Possum. I don't know if you saw Possum.
Yeah.
Partly because I'm arachnophobic, but and it's got that horrible spider thing coming out the bag.
It's so grubby.
But it's so grubby. The bit where he puts his fingers in the mouth and stuff. It's just they to me are the 2 most disturbing movies. But if we're talking scary, I think a kind of pure old school terror,
Ghost Train adrenaline.
Where it's all like a suspense set piece. So I'm going to go for a couple here. I'm going to go for Mike Flanagan's Hush.
Oh yeah,
which I just think
20 minutes. But
no, I just it really got me. I just don't like anything like that. The thought of being out somewhere on my own like that and someone just playing with me like that,
totally,
really gets me.
A bit like The Strangers, right? One of the scariest films of the last decade.
2008. That would have been probably my scariest.
Terrified
of the noughties.
me.
Terrified me. And then the other one, I'm not making any great claims for this movie, saying it's one of the best horror movies of the decade, and it's found footage. So more found footage, but just for pure scares. Taking of Deborah Logan.
Oh yeah.
Did you see that? No, it's Adam Robitel or Robitel. I'm not sure how it's pronounced.
Yeah.
Who went on to make what was that film that came out this year?
I don't know.
Escape Room this year. But he's that film is just a found footage movie, and I'd probably give the movie 3 stars out of 5, but it absolutely terrified me. I was just properly sat there like chewing my fingernails.
There is something about found footage movies, no matter how good or bad they are, they can still make you jump, I think, sometimes, because whatever comes at your face suddenly. I'm similar to you guys. I've gone with, if you're talking about the kind of like scares that make you want to keep the light on at night, it's Hereditary and also The Witch for me. The Witch, which I remember, Rosie, you didn't find The Witch scary,
no, I didn't.
Did you?
I loved it, but I didn't find it scary.
I remember that is...
But I think I over-identified with her. Honestly, I want to live deliciously.
And I don't necessarily think the ending is scary, but there is something about the first maybe 20 minutes of that film where it's like, I've not had this since I watched The Shining, where like with The Witch, I was looking at just woods.
And the world, doesn't it?
Or a man chopping wood, and I was like in a cold sweat.
It's the production design, it's the language, it's just you totally believe you're in that place at that time.
Exactly. There's something
in the wilderness,
subconscious for me. And another one, like you've said with Deborah Logan, my film, I wouldn't necessarily say this is a masterpiece, but I shit myself watching Lights Out, the feature version of Lights Out.
No, it's not as scary as the short.
No, you're right. You're right.
The short is properly...
Well, both scared the shit out of me, to be honest.
Scary.
But I actually wasn't... I was surprised at how good the feature version of Lights Out was. I wouldn't say it's in the same league as The Witch or Hereditary, but in terms of like, they're gonna churn this feature version of this short film out. I loved it, and I thought it was really scary. It made me jump.
Just chuck one more in the mix as well as we're doing this. But another movie I thought had loads of scary moments in it, probably like 6 or 7, where I was properly feasible is It Follows.
That's on my list as well.
That's a scary film.
That is
and I'm sure we're going to talk about that quite a few times. It Follows. And actually, again, I think some people look down upon this movie now, but Insidious, the first Insidious,
first half of Insidious,
oh
freaking scary.
God.
That bit with the old little demon face behind his head and the way it's shot,
the Phantom Menace face,
the Phantom Menace.
Darth Maul.
Where it's shot for too long.
Oh, and the moments leading up to that, just like noises on a baby monitor and a person stood behind the crib. You know, all of those little. It's just a really well directed haunted house movie. I loved it. That really scared me as well. And actually, it's just sprung to mind. But another one, a bit like that I kind of against my will found really scary was The Woman in Black with Daniel Radcliffe.
No.
Where I was, I know.
No, Mike.
But I was so like, ugh, it still scared me. It still.
I'm with you, Mike. Not to that extent. Not to your extent, but I did find it mildly creepy, mildly unnerving.
There's something about that story because I shit my pants watching the play, the film,
the BBC one. Was it 1989? That is terrifying.
Every version in every medium has scared me of The Woman in Black. So there you go. Your favourite kill scene.
Oh, I love this one.
The best kill of the decade. What a question.
Okay, I've got 3 of them. I'm sorry. I just cannot get them down right, and they're all pretty nasty and disturbing. So I'm sorry about this. Number 1 is the obvious one, which is a decapitation in Hereditary.
Yeah.
Not so much for the actual kill, but the way it's treated afterwards. When he drives home, doesn't know what to do, goes to his room, spends the night. In the morning, you hear the mother getting ready to go out shopping, go to the car, the screams. It's horrible. So that's the obvious one. The other 2 I'm going for, which are every bit as good, are the killing of the librarian in Kill List with the hammer.
I knew you'd pick that.
Oh man, just like he's found some horrible pedo stuff, and
it's so scary on so many levels.
So he's obviously very angry young child of his own. The Neil Maskell character, he goes in, he fucks up his hands with a hammer, and you see quite a lot of just flash cuts, but a lot of detail of fingers being more, going off at horrible angles. And then he bends over a table, and this guy's saying thank you and all this, which is really weird and creepy.
Oh my God, it's so scary.
And then he bends over a table, and then just in one cut, they just smash his head with the hammer, and you really see the skull come apart, and it is so nasty.
It's Dan Martin's handiwork, that is.
He's, again, Lords of Chaos, Dan Martin did, which has got some horrific kills in. But I rewatched Kill List last week, first time since it came out, and I was watching it at home on my own, and when that scene came on, when the hammer blow landed, I actually shouted out loud in my living room with the lights off. My dog almost had a heart attack. It was just really got me again. And then the third one, and if anything this is even more nasty, but the kill scene in the bathroom in Snowtown. I don't know if you remember it.
I love that movie, but that's so
I've not seen Snowtown.
Basically
it's brilliant.
Is it?
Justin Kurzel.
Dan is his debut. Daniel Henshall, who plays John Bunting, the serial killer in the Snowtown murders, he's watching it, and his kind of right hand guy is doing the killing, and they've got this guy, and they've got this thing around his neck, and they're just
brother, isn't it?
Yeah, strangling him even, and they keep doing it right to the point where he's going to die, where he's going to pass out, and then they relieve the pressure, and the whole time John Bunting is just looking in his eyes, kind of almost like wanting to watch him die, and they must do it. It's all like one take, and they must do it about 5-6 times, where every time he's going to pass out, and then they let him come back, and then finally they keep going and do it, and it is so grubby and nasty.
God, I don't know if I want to watch this.
John Bunting's right hand man in this case is the brother of he's killing his own brother. And there's reasons,
which makes it even worse.
So fucking traumatic.
And if ever you want to portray a toxic masculinity, Snowtown's the film.
Well, it looked like a kind of, and I saw people comparing it to things like Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer and stuff, and
That's
I thought,
probably
I don't. Yeah, and I just thought, oh no, I haven't, and I still haven't got around to watching it yet.
Oh, you must do. It's wonderful.
That's another one that's properly harrowing.
Yeah,
really. That's a great
really.
choice.
You can't get it out from under your fingernails.
Well, I didn't choose ones that were quite as nasty as that.
Good. That's probably
I chose
good.
Slightly sillier ones. I chose number 1. Put him in a bear and burn him.
Oh yeah.
Oh yes.
Come on, put him in a bear and burn him.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Classic, obviously from Midsummer. Just really really inventive.
Why? Yes.
So I love that. Number 2, I picked partly because I love this movie and I didn't know where else to talk about it.
Okay, good.
But partly because it's just brilliant. Is the wood chipper scene in Tucker and Dale versus
wonderful.
Evil?
Oh my God, amazing!
Which is just hilarious.
Amazing.
I love that film so much, and they're so sweet and good-hearted. And this is this amazing scene where this guy basically trips and goes head first, but he's not meaning to. And
isn't he running from a bee or something?
Something like that. Yeah. And he's in it, and then he's trying to pull him out, but it looks like he's trying to... And anyway,
I love it.
If you haven't seen Tucker and Dale, oh my God.
Absolutely.
Get on it. And the third one actually is really nasty. Do you remember Dream Home from 2010? The one, I believe...
Daniel Craig?
No.
Oh, okay.
Dream House.
Oh, okay.
Hong Kong, but I'm pretty sure you've seen it.
I don't know if I do, Rosie. I don't think I've seen
and
that.
it's this woman who wants to get an apartment. It's a satire, but there's a sequence in that where she basically... suffocates a pregnant woman using a bag and a vacuum cleaner. And it's really harrowing.
No.
It's really horrible. The whole film is a satire. It's about the housing crisis, I think.
Right.
But this scene is quite notorious and quite famous because this woman is very pregnant, and it's just horrible.
Don't take this the wrong way, but I'm now going to go home and find that film and watch it.
Got to watch that immediately. Good choices. I've got one that, Jamie, you've already mentioned. It's the Suspiria dance sequence.
Wonderful.
Only because that film has its ups and downs for me. And I feel like when I think about that film, I will mainly think about that set piece. Yeah. It stands out so much more for me than anything else in the film. So that's why that's mine. And the other one, my really disturbing one, which is one of the only, I think, moments I can remember where in the cinema people got up and left at that moment, was in Mother, Darren Aronofsky's Mother, and the baby's neck snapping. Yeah. There was I've never heard so many just like gasps and then people leaving, at that moment, and it's like, and for me that's why it sticks in my head.
Outrage on Twitter as well from certain people on that one, but they weren't sort of giving it away, but they were saying, that moment in Mother is fucking disgusting. How dare he?
I mean, I didn't think it was disgusting, but it really shocked me and shook me. Did you? What did you think? Were you not a fan of Mother?
So I liked Mother until I realised what it was, and then I thought it was stupid. So for me, weirdly, it's a 3-star film because for me, it's like, it's really beautiful and brilliantly performed. But when it clicks, it's the Bible. You think, oh my God, it's like a first-year drama student that's made this.
You're so right.
And it's like, oh look, there's a flood in the kitchen, and oh look, it's Cain and Abel. That lost. This is ridiculous, and that really lost me.
I think I
because
thought
it came
this is the guy who made Noah, though. Do
you know what? I quite like Noah.
No,
Noah
I didn't.
Noah was what it was. I mean, Noah was ridiculous,
it's
but it was
absolutely ludicrous.
I think you're right, and I think if you try and ignore all of the like nonsense, Bible stuff, and actually watch it as this like horribly anxiety-ridden film about this woman and all these people coming into a house, I found it so difficult to watch.
Well, I liked it while it was that, but I couldn't ignore it when it became screamingly, embarrassingly obvious that it's the Bible. Then it just lost me.
Right.
Hey Mike, it's Rob Watts here, sitting recording from what could very well be a horror film setting in a hostel in southeast Iceland with a blizzard blowing outside, and we just lost electricity. So why don't the Icelanders make more horror films? Anyway, my top horror films of the decade must include the French Catacombs set As Above, So Below, which is just the most claustrophobic, terrifying, just the right kind of mysterious film I've seen in a long time. I absolutely loved it. And I'm not sure what the general consensus was, but for me, I love secret passageways and all that kind of thing, and it was just brilliant. I'd also like to give a shout out to 2 female-centred horror films. One, the French Cannibal movie starring Garance Marillier, who puts in an absolutely stunning central performance, playing a young girl coming of age and realising that she is indeed a cannibal. It's brilliantly told, the soundtrack's fantastic, and it is gory when you want it to be. And the second is the Iranian vampire western in black and white, a sentence that sounds like it could be the worst film in the world, but is in fact absolutely brilliant. And Sheila Vand there plays a skateboarding vampire on the prowl, and it, again, amazing soundtrack, and it just has an incredible atmosphere. And finally, what a decade it's been for director Mike Flanagan. Since switching to horror in 2011 with Absentia, he's knocked them out of the park every single time. So we've had Oculus, Hush, Before I Wake, that prequel to Ouija, which was actually really terrifying, Gerald's Game, the supposedly unfilmable Stephen King novel, Dr. Sleep this year, another Stephen King adaptation which everyone seemed to love, and of course, the televisual masterpiece, The Haunting of Hill House. He's got the sequel to that coming up soon, so let's start the next decade as we mean to go on.
Okay, next category then for you guys. Now, this is similar lines to the previous one. We did our favourite kills. This time, I just want to know, what are your favourite gore moments of the 2010? Nastiest, goriest moments. Rosie?
I've got a couple. Most recently, from a film that I quite liked, the very end of Ready or Not.
Oh,
I don't want to spoil it, but the ending is just an amazing, glorious, hilarious gore shot that's super satisfying. So while I like the film, didn't love it, not because it's a bad film, it's a good film. I just don't massively love that subgenre. By the end, I'd forgotten that I didn't love the film because the ending is so amazing and it's so gory and so brilliant.
And that gore moment got like a cheer and an applause at Fright Fest.
I saw it at a screening and not at Fright Fest.
Right.
I wished that I'd seen it at Fright Fest because
it was a good one for Fright Fest.
It is through and through. And can I add one more? Not super gore, but it's kind of like cringe. And this is in a movie called Raw, which I definitely want to mention because I absolutely love it.
We've not mentioned it yet.
Raw is definitely one of my favorites.
Raw's amazing.
It's an amazing film.
Yeah.
And it's this whole brilliant, hilarious, gross sequence where it's two sisters, and the older sister is waxing.
I knew you were going to do this.
But it's wonderful. Is bikini waxing her younger sister, who doesn't. And then she has to clip it with some scissors, and she cuts her own finger off, the older sister.
Yes.
and so she passed out. And then the younger sister,
who's a cannibal, burgeoning,
starts to eat the finger, and the sister wakes up and catches her doing it.
having a little chew,
having a little munch.
It's just,
as you do.
It's a wonderful sequence for so many reasons. It's just it's super uncomfortable, but it's brilliant.
That was one of a couple of films this decade that made the news headlines for people fainting or being carried out at festivals because of the gore and stuff.
I mean, I thought it was brilliant, but I didn't find it disturbing. I thought that sequence was hilarious and brilliant.
It is gross, but funny.
The thing is, there's always, if you've got gore like that, there's always going to be someone who faints. If it's showing at stuff like, I think it was Toronto, where someone apparently passed out, that's a festival audience, mainstream film critics, and not going to fantastic festival, Fright Fest. So when they watch a movie like that, they're not going to be hard on people, and you can see why someone's going to pass out.
But
then it becomes all the news.
Actually, you've just reminded me of one that I didn't put down based on literally that. Laws of Chaos. Laws of Chaos, yes.
Oh, what, the suicide or the stabbing?
The suicide or the stabbing.
Yeah, they're both.
But there's one sequence in that, and I love
the suicide.
Laws of Chaos.
Gore.
It's brilliant, but as
brain
a gore
splatter.
Scene, it's really, really, really triggering. But a very close up wrist slashing and shot in the face, and the camera
Dan
Martin
is a genius.
He is.
But that sequence in that film was a point where it's like, nope, this is too much. It's a great film.
And I've talked about it on the podcast already, but I've been to 3 screenings of that film now, one at LFF, one at Fright Fest in Glasgow, and another somewhere else, and all of them, another in Soho screening rooms in London. All 3 of them, somebody has fainted or been taken ill.
So I think I was
moment.
at the Soho screening rooms because someone was taken out of mine.
Right. It's happened every time at that moment. I think Dan Martin has put that on his CV.
I bet he has.
But it's really intense, shocking. Jamie, what about you? Favourite gore moments?
Okay, I'm going to do one which I've just thought of top of my head right here, so I hadn't planned this, but just to try and lighten up a bit, because I've done a few horrendous ones. I don't want people to be worried about me. So I really enjoyed the bit where the snowman is decapitated in Anna and the Apocalypse. Remember that bit? And there's just jets and jets and jets of blood in a really over the top fun way.
That's a lovely film.
It's a lovely film. So if you want gore, because I think gore can often be played for just sort of almost warmth in a weird way. It can just be really funny. So that's my fun one. And then the other one, which isn't fun at all, it's bloody nasty, but it was wonderful, was a film called The Furies at Fright Fest this year. I don't know if you saw it.
It's about the kind of people in the woods or something. I think I did see this.
Basically, young women are kidnapped, and when they wake up, they're in this game where they have to try and escape, and there's masked men hunting them down with axes trying to kill them. So it's kind of like a most dangerous game, kind of, that usual plot of murder for sport. But there's one scene where someone has their face sliced off with an axe, slowly from the side. And I don't know how the hell they did it, but they just slice off the whole of the front of their face, getting under all the features until they just have their face sort of dangling in their fingers, and it probably lasts about 30 seconds or a minute, like just slowly cutting away. And like I spoke to a lot of people after that at Fright Fest who've seen a lot of gore, and they were just like, wow, how did they do that? That was incredible.
Amazing.
That's the Fright Fest reaction. The mainstream reaction would just be like, lock these people up, but there you go.
And actually some of the best gore moments are those moments where you're actually just marvelling at the practical effects. You're like,
really
how did they do that?
Yeah, it was stunning. Absolutely stunning.
And actually, speaking of, so a lot of mine have already been spoken about, but Gerald's Game for me, there is the degloving scene in Gerald's Game.
That is nasty.
I was like sat on my living room because it was a Netflix film, and I was like physically squirming around on the sofa while that was happening. Absolutely horrible. And another one I just want to mention in terms of like smaller body horror bits. Yeah. Black Swan, I'm talking about Darren Aronofsky again, but there's a moment in Black Swan where she has like a kind of hangnail and she goes to peel it off.
I hate stuff like that.
Yeah, me too.
That fucked me up. And like that kind of moment of gore for me is just as effective as like somebody getting their face sliced off with an axe. It's like those little nail moments or whatever.
Like Stir of Echoes in the noughties had that a scene where their nails scrape on wood and one bends back.
But like I remember, Rosie, you saying when we talked about Cronenberg, like food grossness.
Oh, I can't. I was thinking it's not gore, but there's a scene in Cheap Thrills, which is a movie of this decade, which I love.
And there's
loads of gross stuff in that, but it's the bit with the dog, and I had to go and leave the room because I can't really deal with food grossness. And like it isn't.
Well, it's like not a horror film, but Pink Flamingos, and that scene in Pink Flamingos, I'm like, nope.
But talking of gore where you don't see anything, the opposite to the Furies one I've just done, where it's sort of slow motion, take it all off. There's a couple of bits actually in what's the name of that film? The Australian Hounds of Love. Hounds of Love, where you don't see what they've done to the girl who's chained to the bed, but there's a couple of shots where you just see at the bottom of the bed and there's all these bloody tissues and just a dildo just on the floor, and that's all they show, and it's the most disturbing thing you will ever see. It's just 2 seconds with nothing happening, but you just put the picture together and
God, it's like that bit in Seven where they just show the Polaroid of the knife dildo thing, and you just think, oh fucking hell, absolutely grim. Okay, this is a tricky one. This is more, we're in an Oscar category here, but what's been your favourite horror performance of the whole decade? Any standouts for you?
Well, I think we'd all agree that Toni Collette in Hereditary was amazing.
Answer, right?
And was like, I was really sad that she was overlooked for Oscar, because I genuinely think it was just a phenomenal performance all round.
Yes,
the
agreed.
performance of her career, and it's a considerable career, and
and actually I thought she was even one of the standouts in The Sixth Sense 20 years ago as well. It's amazing. She nails it in most stuff she does.
Yeah, she's amazing. But I wanted to mention Don't Breathe, which we haven't talked about yet, which I thought was a really, really great movie.
That's a scary film.
Except for one bit at the end, the twist, which I don't really like. I didn't think it was necessary.
Are you talking about the turkey baster?
Yeah, and I just think, can we just quickly, okay, but she's pregnant, so why has he still got a massive jug of his jizz in the fridge? For safekeeping.
Yeah, just in case.
Just in case this doesn't work out, I've got an enormous jug of jizz just here.
You never know when you're going to need it, Rosie.
You never know when you're going to need it. But I thought both Jane Levy and Stephen Lang in that were both really good.
Really good.
Yeah, and my third one I wanted to mention, Lupita Nyong'o, who is absolutely brilliant in Us, but is also brilliant in Little Monsters, playing completely different.
She's wonderful.
I think she's a really interesting actress who obviously has massive range.
So how amazing that she's become a genre.
And completely different performances, because in Us, she's freaking terrifying, and also like big emotional performance at the same time. Little Monsters, she's a little ray of sunshine, and also completely kicks ass and does comedy brilliantly.
So good. Such a good film, that Little Monsters. Excellent choice. Jamie, what about you?
Well, I've gone for actress and actor. I'm with Rosie, and I'm sure with you, Mike. Toni Collette for Hereditary, I think it has to be your standout. Just staggering. And then for the actor, I've gone Daniel Henshall for Snowtown, who plays John Bunting, because he is so charismatic and charming in that Aussie bloke sort of Barbie beers kind of way, like get your mates together, he's all like having a laugh, and then absolutely terrifying, the most toxic male ever, who basically bullies everyone into killing loads of people in the most graphic, horrible ways. And it's just a performance that gets under your skin and you just can't shake it.
Nice.
That's a great choice.
I'm with you guys on Toni Collette. I've got Toni Collette in Hereditary. The other one, again, maybe quite an obvious one, but I've gone Daniel Kaluuya in Get Out, which I just think is
that's a good one.
Every performance in that film, I've talked about this already in the podcast, but the way in which, like, there's this kind of like everyone's doing or saying something, but their eyes are doing something else. And Daniel Kaluuya is like all Daniel Kaluuya does. He has the difficult job of just kind of reacting to things throughout the whole film. It's just him like looking at what's going on and looking uncomfortable. And I think sometimes that's some of the hardest stuff to do. And obviously, like that moment has been memed to death now, but where he's in the sunken place. But that moment when he's in the chair and he's like trying to fight it, and tears are coming down his face, but he's trying to kind of hold it together. And there's about 6 different emotions going on at once in his head, where he's kind of suspicious and scared and sad.
He was nominated, wasn't he?
He was nominated for an Oscar. He should have won. Gary Oldman won playing Winston Churchill. He should have won. Absolutely amazing. They're my favourites. And also, we've mentioned it briefly, but Creep, Mark Duplass in Creep, I think is incredible as well.
I'm assuming you're Aaron.
Yeah, I'm Aaron. Nice to meet you.
Joseph. Oh my God. Oh my God. This is going to be a good day.
Okay, let's move on. We've talked about how there are loads of new voices and new directors this decade. What's been your favourite? A favourite sort of debut feature by a new director in horror?
Well, I'm going to go mad on this one.
Oh, okay,
in terms of, when we're saying we're going to do 2 or 3, it's just incredible to me. And it's always been the way in horror, like debut films, because, people can make horror movies maybe a bit cheap or with their mates or whatever the reason is. People have always cut their teeth in the genre and done amazing things, be it Shivers, Evil Dead. There's so many great horror debuts, Blair Witch Project, Last House on the Left. So this decade, I think many of the best horror films are debuts. So I've done a big list of about 10. I'm just going to read out. I'm really sorry. And then I'm going to choose one.
Because you posted something on Twitter, didn't you, recently about asking for the best debut? And there were so many people, so many choices.
People actually came up. I listed about 20, and then people were going, well, what about this? And Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer, if you don't count his documentaries. And this list of best horror debuts got up to 50 or something of all great films. But of this decade, The Witch, Snowtown, Get Out, Bone Tomahawk, Hereditary, Hounds of Love, Under the Shadow, The Babadook, Cabin in the Woods, Monsters, all debuts. It's just stunning, absolutely stunning. But if I had to pick one, I keep going on about it, but I'm going to go Snowtown.
Oh God, I'm really gutted I've not seen Snowtown.
I've rewatched a lot of my favourite horror movies in the last month, ready for this and for my own lists and stuff. And Snowtown, I loved it. Well, loved is the wrong word. It's terrible. It's disgusting, but the first time it really affected me, and then watching it this time, it just bowled me over.
Can I tell a story about Snowtown?
Please.
I don't know whether you might remember this, Jamie, but so it was back when I was working on Total Film, and we had a work experience program that I ran, and I really hadn't done any research. I really hadn't read about what Snowtown was. It was just like, Snowtown, it's a horror movie.
Sounds like a Christmas movie, doesn't it? Like, nice and happy.
It's a horror movie. It played at Cannes. All right, I'll get to that. And it was the first day of worky. He was I think he was jet lagged for some reason. So anyway, I said to this work experience guy, do you want to come to a screening? And he was like, yeah, that sounds good. Really hadn't done my research. And we were the only people in this screening room. And that movie is brilliant, but it is incredibly oppressive. Like, not just of what's going on, but also the sound design. I don't know if you remember, but it's like, it's so in your head and so and it's so inescapable. And that film is so traumatic. And there was like a point where I was sort of leaning down, like with my head in my hands, and he, I think, was only maybe 19 or something, and was like, are you all right? And I'm like, yeah, are you? And he's like, I don't know. And like afterwards I was like, I'm so sorry, I really should have done a bit more research into that film. I mean, this is an amazing film, but
I love that. I often find that's a bonding experience for people, you know. It can be,
because we were the only 2 people in the room as well. It wasn't like, if you're not all right we can leave, because we kind of can't leave.
I think I've got a story to beat that, Rosie. Again, talking of work experience people at Total Film, you were in charge of a work experience campaign. I can remember you said to me one week, we've got this, like, she was only 18, 19, we got this woman in, like, have you got any screenings you're going to? Can you take her to something? I said, I'm going to see Shame tonight.
Oh my God.
And I actually didn't really know. I vaguely knew what it was about, but not to the point of what it is. So she went along with me to see Shame, and we sat down and we were in the front row, literally in the front row. And within about 10 minutes, we had Michael Fassbender's dick in our faces. And then 2 hours later, we walked out and I sort of said, night then. She said night, and off we went our separate ways. And the next day she hardly spoke to me, and it was all very weird and horrible.
What can you do? When I was my first year working on the BBC film programme, I had to accompany at the time Claudia Winkleman. I was in charge of Claudia Winkleman's diaries, and I escorted her to screenings, and we sat in Soho House, which is quite the old Soho House. It's quite a small screening room, and we watched the entire 4-hour nymphomaniac Lars von Trier together. So that was quite a jump in the deep end for me. That was an experience I'm not going to forget. Anyway, let's move on. So debut features. So Jamie, they were yours. Rosie, what about you?
Jamie, you've knocked off the biggies.
Yeah.
But I would add to that Resolution for Benson and Moorhead, who I think are just wonderful and brilliant and geniuses. And of course, Rabies, which was the directorial debut.
Yes.
I won't be able to pronounce this correctly, but I'm going to have a go. I think it's Aaron Cachales and Navot Papashado. Apologies, guys, if I've got that wrong.
That was good.
But it's
than we do, definitely.
But it's a really good film, and I think it's one that has, like, I'd forgotten about it, and the image, the cover image of the DVD does not look like the film.
Right.
So I was like, what is this rubbish about rabies? And it's not about rabies. It's just really, really good.
Yeah. Interesting. I mean, I won't go on. All the ones that you guys have added, if I had to pick one favourite, I would say The Witch by Robert Eggers, because that's my favourite of those.
Oh, and actually, yes, can I add in here? Absentia, I believe, is Mike Flanagan's debut, which is very overlooked and very, very good.
Was that this decade?
Yes.
Was
Yes, it was.
I think it was. That's the one with the tunnel, right?
Yes,
that's scary.
He made the short.
£60,000 that cost, I believe. $60,000.
And he did a short of Oculus, which was like half an hour, which is brilliant, absolutely just amazing.
He's a genius. He's great.
He's amazing. Great. He's been one of the big, actually, and we didn't really talk about him when we talked about Ari Aster and all these people. Mike Flanagan has been pretty much a consistent hitter in the horror genre, hasn't he?
Actually, I think it's this decade. I could be wrong about that.
Made 6 or 7 horror movies and Haunting of Hill House in this decade then. So that's amazing.
He's done pretty well. Yeah, he's done an amazing job. Okay, all right. What about, this is a random one, but I noticed there's been a lot of Stephen King adaptations. So I wanted to ask you, what's been speaking of Mike Flanagan, what's been your favourite Stephen King adaptation of this decade?
For me, there's 2 that stand out, and it is, speaking of Mike Flanagan, Gerald's Game, which I think is an unfilmable book, and the way he came up to deal with that was wonderful, really clever. And then obviously It, and I'm going the first It here. Chapter 2 I had problems with. I still liked it, but I think some things it gets really wrong. Whereas the first It, I just think for getting the flavour of that book, especially the children, the kind of losers club, that kind of almost Stand By Me but with a monster vibe, and it just does it so well, and it was so wonderful. And I'm a huge fan of that book. I read it when I was a teenager, and it brought it all flooding back and gave me all the feels, and I loved it.
Yeah, it's so nostalgic, that film, isn't it? Yeah. What about you, Rosie?
Well, I was a big fan of it as well. But I want to have a mention, talking of Mike Flanagan, for Dr. Sleep, which I thought was a lot better than I could possibly have hoped.
Better than the book?
Better than it had any
arguably. I mean, I like the book, but the changes he made were very
really good.
Intelligent changes that really worked. I thought Rebecca Ferguson was so perfectly cast, and she was just electric. Like every second she was on screen, and I saw that movie twice, and I enjoyed it more the second time. I mean, it's not as good as The Shining, but that's ridiculous.
That's ridiculous
thing to hold it up to.
It's like saying Citizen Kane has a sequel. It's like, it's totally.
It's the way he bridges those worlds as well between Kubrick and King, and Never Twain Shall Meet. You just can't bridge those worlds. They're so different, and he does it.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Totally. 100% agree with you. I think I would go Dr. Sleep as well. I think what an amazing feat that he pulled off a sequel to Kubrick's film and a sequel to the book, and in an adaptation of the book,
and still made it his own.
And still made it, and it still felt like a Mike Flanagan film as well.
It really did.
Even had a degloving scene, didn't it? It's gross. Yeah, I loved it. Okay, best horror TV show. We've talked about TV shows. They've been big this decade. What's been your favourites?
Well, I've watched quite a few of them, and there's a lot of average stuff out. Well, average is wrong, but like decent, like Bates Motel I enjoyed. I thought Creepshow was decent, Scream was decent. Black Mirror, if we're counting it, has some amazing episodes. But for me, I mentioned it earlier, the one that really stands out is Haunting of Hill House, which I just think is over 10 episodes, a major achievement.
Amazing. Jamie, I need to ask you to tell me again the story of how, because aren't you a fan of the Exorcist TV show?
Yes.
And hasn't that led to you being blocked?
Yes.
By William Friedkin.
I totally forgot The Exorcist. Behind Haunting of Hill House, The Exorcist is my favourite horror TV show this decade. And it's the only reason I can think that I'm blocked by William Friedkin. But I'm a big fan of William Friedkin's work. You know, French Connection, Sorcerer, Exorcist, love it all. I've only ever been complimentary about William Friedkin on Twitter. I've interviewed William Friedkin. I have a signed French Connection original poster by William Friedkin in which he writes, like, so great to meet you, Jamie, blah, 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 wonderful.
And he's blocked me.
And he's the only person I know of who has ever blocked me on Twitter. And the only reason I can think of it is because I love the Exorcist TV show. And when it came out, I kept tweeting how wonderful it was. And I presume, I don't know, but I presume maybe he doesn't like it, or they did something he didn't want to do, or whatever. But obviously he's seen it somehow and it's pissed him off, and I'm blocked. So
that's amazing.
Thanks, William.
Absolutely amazing. Love that. Rosie, what about you? Favourite horror TV shows?
So those were great shouts, except for The Exorcist. Although I haven't seen it, but
it's so good.
So I love some series of American Horror Story. I thought Coven actually was one of my favourites. I thought the very first one was really good as well.
I've only seen the first two series of American Horror.
Yeah, I didn't like Freak Show dragged on a bit for me, but
that was where I
Coven,
lost it.
I liked it.
That was where I lost it.
Yeah, so that was good. I mentioned Marianne before, but I honestly cannot emphasise enough. Please go and watch Marianne. It is really, really creepy. It's French, by the way, so subtitles. Right. But talking of Netflix foreign horror, the first series of Dark is very good.
Oh, I've still not seen this yet.
The trouble with Dark is it's extremely complicated. So it's set in 3 different timelines, and because it's maybe sort of 5 or 6 different families in this town, and you see them at different ages, but it's quite difficult to remember who everybody is.
So by season 2.
So when it's like, oh my God, that's the young Charlotte, and you're like, oh, remind me who Charlotte was again?
Yeah.
Like, you kind of have to watch it with a Wikipedia family tree in your hand, but it's creepy, it's clever, it's very intriguing. Although I have to say I didn't finish series 2 because it was so confusing, I just couldn't keep up with the story. But season 1 I really think is worth giving a shot to, and if you are on it and paying attention and are okay with subtitles and very complicated plots.
Oh, okay.
Dark is very good.
Have either of you guys seen The Terror?
No.
Ridley Scott, right?
Yeah, that is the one that I've missed, and I keep meaning to get to it, but I've heard great things about that. So maybe we should just mention it on the off chance, but I have heard it's very good.
Have either of you guys watched Channel Zero, the TV show Channel Zero? No, because that was recommended to me by listeners on this podcast, and it's scary. I think it's on Amazon Prime. You can watch the whole thing, and they're mini-series. It's kind of like American Horror Story. It's an anthology, so each series is its own self-contained, and they're all based on the kind of creepypasta, kind of like internet folklore.
Okay.
And they're short. Each season is like 6 half-hour episodes.
Right.
Lovely.
I know what your favourite is, though, Mike. You don't have to tell me.
What? Go on.
Sabina for Teenage Witch, isn't it?
No, it's definitely not. My favourite is, of course, The Haunting of Hill House. Goes without saying. But I had to give a shout out to Channel Zero because there is it's a really scary first series that I saw.
Okay.
And it's worth a watch.
I need to check that out.
And Black Mirror.
Black Mirror is brilliant.
Black Mirror. Some of the stuff in Black Mirror has been some of the most horrific stuff I've watched as well.
Yeah, and I think whereas it used to be there'd be 1 or 2 good ones, I think it's really nailing it. It's really
and actually, if you want to kind of sum up the horror and fear and anxiety of modern day life in this decade, Black Mirror kind of ticks every box, doesn't it, in some ways, of all the stuff we're scared of. Okay, before we get on to our next topic, here is a little message from friend of the pod, Jen Handorf. What is Jen's favourite horror movie of the 2010s? Let's find out.
Because the metric of a favorite film is so mutable, I like to go with the solid definition of the film I have watched the most times. It is 100% The Train to Busan. I loved what this film did with imagining the zombie genre. I love what it did with its drama. Its action is both thrilling and believable, and I really enjoyed watching it again and again with different groups of people. So if you're sitting down and trying to figure out what you're going to put on, I definitely recommend Train to Busan. Watch it with your friends. You can all enjoy it.
Thank you, Jen Handorf. Now, another quick message from Zobo with a shotgun. Now, as we all know, Zobo's got pretty extreme tastes. So what has been her favourite film of the 2010s? Let's find out.
Hi Mike and all the Evolution of Horror listeners, it's Zobo with a shotgun here. So my favourite horror film from the last decade is a Turkish horror film, and that is none other than Can Evrenol's Baskin. So it came out in 2015 and it's a hallucinogenic, nightmare-induced, hellish experience that really gets under your skin. It's very disturbing. It has really messed up imagery. It's horrifically sexual, and just a fantastic piece of extreme cinema that also has an amazing storyline to it. It really fucks with your mind, but it's also very progressive, and I think just a really, really gripping piece of extreme horror film from the last decade. So yes, Baskin is my favourite.
A big thanks to Zobo there as well. Okay, next category for you guys. We've talked about this briefly already, but sequels, reboots, remakes, sequels, returning properties, returning franchises. What have been some of your highlights?
I mean, I mentioned it already, but I thought Halloween was very successful. We both liked it. Second part less so.
Yeah.
I still liked it. I just didn't like the ending. I thought the ending was ridiculous.
Yeah.
Doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, Carrie didn't work for me. I thought that was...
No, Chloe Grace Moretz was a bit too cool for Carrie.
Yeah, exactly.
It's wrong choice.
Yeah.
So silly.
Yeah.
Totally the wrong choice,
Yeah. Jamie, what about you?
For me, the best sequel is The Conjuring 2. Which yes,
I hated that.
Oh, I really like it.
I hated it.
Yeah.
Did you?
So long.
No,
it was
I preferred it to the first one.
I think I did as well.
Yeah, and the sequence with the nun, which then obviously gave a spin-off for Nun.
The best
was
scene,
just
of course.
Wonderful film.
And
then It. If we're talking reboots, I'm counting that as a reboot because they did the TV series, etc., mini-series. So it's chapter 1.
Here's a good one that I thought of, that it was a sneaky sequel, was M. Night Shyamalan's Split, which I really enjoyed.
Clever.
And actually, M. Night Shyamalan getting a comeback through Blumhouse. He's had a kind of renaissance, which was really interesting.
Visit, Split, and Glass, so all Blumhouse
It was
movies.
a shame Glass wasn't as good as it could have been.
I quite like Glass.
But Split I found really fun, and then the fact that it turned out to be a sequel to Unbreakable was really cool.
Well, actually,
that's
been a little bit of a trend of this decade.
Yes, the secret sequel.
Yes, exactly. The stealth sequel. So obviously, the movie that was once known as The Woods suddenly, Blair Witch.
Yeah,
which I liked more than other people. But
I didn't like it. Yeah. And actually, we haven't talked about Adam Wingard, have we? But
Wingard, he's another big one.
Oh, yeah, he's another. Yeah, and also, of course. 10 Cloverfield Lane, so there was Valencia, and oh my god, it's 10 Cloverfield Lane, which again I thought was brilliant.
Loved that film.
If I've got to call my favourite sequel, I'm probably going to say 10 Cloverfield Lane. Actually.
That's such a good shout. I love 10 Cloverfield Lane. I've almost forgotten about it.
Left field.
Yeah, that's so good. And also, let's not forget, back in the beginning of the decade, 2010, Wes Craven's Scream 4, which I don't think is actually as bad.
No, Mike. No.
Come on, it's better than 3. It's better than 3. All right.
Is it?
Is it though?
All right, let's move on. Best monster creature, an original new monster. What have we had? What's been the best ones this decade?
There was a load of good stuff in Cabin in the Woods, and I feel like we haven't I don't think we've talked enough about Cabin in the Woods because I think that movie was really important. And actually, now I know that this isn't how things work, but that movie was an absolute call to say, right, let's burn to the ground everything that we know about horror and let's start again. Now, I'm not saying that is what happened or it's got anything to do with the Cabin in the Woods, but there's a tiny element that it's
so clever.
Happen.
It's like a really interesting thing that you could look back on it as the nail in the coffin of old horror.
Because that was 2011. It was saying, fuck all this. Let's just have something new. And Jamie, as you pointed out, we've had loads of new stuff that's really, really exciting. Yeah. And that brought us The Merman. And I think The Merman deserves a little shout out.
The best kill. We even talked about it with best kill, The Merman, best monster. Yeah, you're so right. Love The Cabin in the Woods. What about you, Jamie?
Okay, I'm going for 2 here. I'm going for It, and not It in It, as in Pennywise the Clown, but It in It Follows.
Yeah.
As in the shape-shifting monster can be whatever, it can be a naked man on a roof, it could be a friend.
When it's the tall guy coming through the door.
With those kind of cavernous dark eyes. Yeah, so It Follows, that really freaked me out. And then the other one I'm going for is the female in Under the Skin. The Scarlett Johansson character is a kind of alien type, are we counting out? I don't know, but I'm having it. And I think she's wonderful in the way she kind of takes the lives of the men with the black liquid, the pool where they get submerged and kind of float there, and it's just it just haunts you.
Yeah, and actually we didn't talk. I should have mentioned that for my favourite performance, Scarlett Johansson.
Oh, God,
she's brilliant.
God, she's amazing, isn't she?
It's absolutely amazing.
I mean, a couple of monster shout-outs that I wouldn't say are my favourite monsters, but are monster movies that I thought were really effective that we haven't talked about yet. I think The Ritual is really good.
Yes,
I love The Ritual.
And I don't think it's good because of the monsters. I think it's good because of the male relationships.
The setup.
I just thought it was incredibly
and that went
believable.
To Netflix. Did it get a cinema
that got
release?
A cinema release?
It did get a cinema release.
I kind of felt a bit like the kind of male The Descent, a bit like these kind of like guys.
Better though, I would argue.
A guy trip, and it was very much about the masculinity and about the tensions between them, and then results in a monster movie kind of thing. Yeah, it was interesting.
But I guess the difference. So I really like The Descent. Don't get me wrong, but the female relationships are all a bit like, you slept with my husband, whereas the male relationships are a little bit more tender, and it's a little bit more about their difficulty, their inability to talk to each other about their grief and about their pain. Which I thought was very well done in The
amazing.
Ritual.
I remember those amazing visual moments where like he would dream and it would go from the woods back to that like off license, you know, and it was so cool. The visual kind of cues in that were really cool.
Very cool movie.
And although I think the movie's a bit so-so, I thought the monsters and grabbers were really good.
Oh yeah, nice.
Yeah,
nice. Good. I would argue the most iconic new monster of the decade is the Babadook as well. I think that is the monster that everyone will now everyone knows what that is almost.
Yeah,
you
they
know,
do.
A terrifying like kind of mix of like Freddy Krueger and German expressionism and all these different things that we're scared of. I love the Babadook, absolutely, and when you see the monster, it's as scary as the build-up, I think, which is really cool.
I liked the Hallow for Cohen Hardy.
Yeah, the Hallow was really good.
The little baby snatcher things. Yeah,
that's a real sort of proper DIY monster movie done with tremendous craft and passion.
It's scary as well. Yeah. Corin Hardy was going to be the next big thing.
And then he made The Nun.
It kind of is, because The Nun took 365 million.
Yeah, but nobody liked it.
No, they didn't. They didn't. I hate to admit I didn't like it, apart from a couple of bits. But
and then he was going to do The Crow, but no.
Yeah, and that didn't happen.
Also, and I know the film is terrible, but the idea and the monster that is the Slender Man and how that came how that came to be a huge phenomenon through the internet this decade as well is quite an important one.
That's another internet film,
yeah.
Hello, Mike, and all of you lovely Evolution of Horror podcast listeners. It's Mike here, the podcast illustrator. It's been an amazing decade for horror films. Films like Get Out, The Witch, Hereditary, just to name a few, especially in the last couple of years. But my favourite horror film of the decade still is Jennifer Kent's 2014 masterpiece, The Babadook. I don't think this film has been topped in its handling of the subject matter and also the incredible design of the Babadook itself. It still scares the shit out of me, and I've watched it about 10 times now. So here is to the next 10 years, and to more horror. All right, cheers, bye.
Season's greetings, Mike. Mary Wild here from the Projections podcast. My favorite horror film from the last decade. It's a tough ask because there have been so many outstanding releases, but my favorite from a psychological point of view would have to be The Invitation. So this is the 2015 American horror thriller directed by Karen Kusama. The scene at the dinner table in particular is the single best representation of PTSD I've ever seen on film. It's very scary. And the thing about PTSD is that reality itself becomes an unreliable experience for the sufferer. And society looking in can easily assume that the person affected is being irrational. And when these ambivalent factors are mixed in with a social event that could potentially pose a threat, such as this dinner party, it creates a viewing experience that is convincingly disturbing because, identifying as we do with an unreliable narrator, we no longer know who to trust and what to believe. This is one of the most effective psychological horror films I've ever seen. Dread Central said of The Invitation that it taps into our general distress of the world and how our survival instincts have been muted in order to maintain the appearance of being polite. I quite like that descriptor. I think it's accurate. Karen Kusama is known for directing films such as Jennifer's Body and the recent release Destroyer with Nicole Kidman, but I believe The Invitation is her best work, and certainly my favorite horror film from the last 10 years. Happy viewing!
Okay, what about best cinematography, or kind of the most beautiful horror movie, if you want to say that, of the 2010s? What's been your favourite looking horror film?
I'm going to go, because it's a complete head-melting, just weird experience, psychotropic experience. I'm going Mandy.
Nice, good choice.
I watched that on a big screen at Cannes, and it just washed over me, and I felt woozy and otherworldly and transported, and I just adored it.
Nice. Rosie?
So some of these we've mentioned already, so I'll skirt over them, but I want to definitely shout out for The Endless, but also for Spring. Oh, and in Best Monster, and she's not just one monster, she's a load of them. But she's a lot of monsters.
That's a great shout.
But Spring is beautiful.
Yeah.
It's kind of like Male Fantasy Twilight, but it is beautiful.
Yeah.
And The Endless as well is just an absolutely gorgeous,
stunning
looking film.
The amount they can do with a small budget,
Limited
those two.
budget,
You know,
I'm a big fan. I'm clearly nerding out.
I think they're amazing.
They're amazing.
Benson and Moorhead, yeah.
And we also haven't mentioned Thelma, which is absolutely stunning. Really, really beautiful film.
Yeah.
With some really strange, really harrowing standout moments. I think that's one to look out for.
Nice. I would go to repeat a movie we've already talked about, but Under the Skin, particularly the moments in the black goop and the cinematography in that film, and also the kind of candid cinematography where she's walking around Glasgow, shopping malls and stuff, and in boots and stuff.
That's van, just chatting to normal blokes on the street,
or just hanging out in that nightclub with those girls.
What bizarre mix of like art house filmmaking, and then also whatever that
verite kind of thing,
and like that film has to have, well, for me, has one of the most harrowing moments of the decade, which is the sequence on the beach,
the baby on the beach,
where the dog goes in, and then the person goes in,
just
and then
the
other person goes in, and everybody dies, and it's completely pointless and meaningless. But that's what you do because you're human. You're an idiot.
She just watches,
and then the baby just walks.
Yeah,
she leaves it.
It's absolutely terrifying. Yeah,
and all the shots just in the Scottish Highlands or whatever it is, when you got the motorbikes going down the roads, just the headlamps. It's wonderful.
And then another one I'm going to mention. A lot of people had a problem with the cinematography in this film, but I loved Gaspar Noé's climax.
So did I, Mike. So did I.
I know this is a film that divides everyone, and some people hate it, but and again, like you said about Mandy, woozy, trippy, weird. When I watched that after a few drinks at Fright Fest, I fucking loved it. So the cinematography is like, it screams at you a bit like with Birdman and stuff.
Yeah, it's
like
showing
very much
off,
look at
ostentatious,
isn't it? But I loved it.
But when it's going across ceilings and between legs and sort of swirling and coiling around bodies, it's amazing.
Yeah, loved it. Okay, all right. What about then most underrated horror movie? Maybe a horror movie that hasn't got the appreciation it deserves from this decade.
Okay.
May I? Or do you want to?
You go.
Okay, I'm going. So some of these we've already mentioned, so I won't mention them.
Okay.
Rabies. But I would like to throw out the Excision.
Yes,
which is fascinating and odd and angry and beautiful and really subversive.
Yes.
This was Annalyn McCord is the star, who I believe she was the star of was it Beverly Hills 90210 remake or something like that. Anyway, Annalyn McCord playing against type. Really kind of, although it's directed by a man, it's feminist, it's angry, it's beautiful, it's clever, and it's shocking, and it is about parent-child relationships and particularly a mother-daughter relationship. It's got a really good ending as well.
Nice.
Thought that was great.
That's a great shout. You got any more, Rosie?
I was going to go Citadel, which I loved. Which I think is set in Scotland. It's Kieran Foy. It is kind of a quest movie and a descent into hell, but it's not down, it's up. So it's a guy who's been, I believe, his flat's been broken into, but he has to go into this tower to save, I think, his sister. So it's like a quest, but a descent into hell, but in a high rise in Scotland. But it's really, really clever, and it's got a lot of mythical elements to it, which I really like, that really appeals to me. And third one I wanted to add is Sleep Tight,
Oh God,
that's great.
The scary guy under the bed.
And it's got a really dark sense of humour. It's basically about a concierge who is incredibly miserable, who is tormented by a young woman who lives in his apartment block, who's just really happy and cheerful and positive, and he can't bear it. He cannot bear her happiness, and so kind of goes out of his way to piss her off. But because she's just like really positive and optimistic, she's like, oh well, never mind. And he can't stand it.
And he creeps around her flat, doesn't he? He sleeps under her bed and stuff, or he's under
exactly. But weirdly, it's really clever because you kind of cheer for him.
Yes, and you feel tense at those moments where maybe he's going to get caught, etc. You don't want him to get caught.
Again, I didn't love the ending, but I don't want to spoil it. All of this unnecessary sexualisation and endings, but other than that, I thought it was a fantastic film.
Agreed. Jamie?
Okay, I'm going to go for The Battery by Jeremy Gardner, just because, like I said, there's been a lot of zombie movies, only a few good ones, and it's the one that a lot of people don't know about. They've heard about The Girl with All the Gifts, Train to Busan, obviously, One Cut of the Dead, and The Battery, it's basically a kind of buddy movie, and they're just baseball players who, you know, they've survived in the zombie apocalypse. They're just going about their business, hanging out, doing fuck all really, just chatting, messing around, and then gradually it builds and builds and builds, and the last 20 minutes, which is pretty much all one shot, stuck in a van as they're surrounded by a horde of zombies who there's just nowhere to go. They can't get out. The zombies aren't going to leave, and it just becomes so claustrophobic and really grueling.
It's really good. It's a really testament to like what you can do with no money making a zombie film, isn't it? It's like an interesting,
like
different
a
spin.
mumblecore zombie movie.
Yeah.
You know, it's just two guys hanging out. They just sit on a porch, they have a beer, they find a house, they go in, and
an incredible sequence where a guy has a wank in a car while a zombie is pressed up against the window watching. Amazing. That's what you want from a zombie film, you know.
He gets caught.
Yeah.
At the vital moment, Jeremy Gardner comes back and then obviously takes a piss out of him. He was having a wank over a zombie.
Love it. I don't know
that one. I've got one more. Sorry, Mike. And Fashionista by Simon Rumley.
Yeah, it's very good.
Which is just stunning because it's really original, about a woman who is just, her emotional crutch is her clothing. She's obsessed with clothes, outfits. You know, she's got all these amazing kind of almost like costumes in a way, that she puts all these outfits together, and then her husband, she finds out, is cheating on her. She starts to she's in a very bad place, almost like a mental breakdown, and then various things happen from there, and it's just a stunning original piece of work and traps you in a mindset, a kind of descending into hell mindset.
Yeah, that Fashionista is a great choice, and that has an interesting ending with some political stuff going on.
Oh, it really does.
Well. Yeah. Simon Rumley's actually a really interesting filmmaker.
Yeah, I think he's one of our best.
Yeah.
Amazing. Good choices. Well, your choices are better than mine. I was going to make a case for, and he's not particularly underrated critically, but I would say, you know, talking to mainstream audiences, a lot of people have never heard of him. I want to make a case for Peter Strickland, because we've not really talked about him yet. And Barbarian Sound Studio, and also In Fabric, is one of my favourite films of the decade. I think that he makes whatever they are. They're not really horror. They're kind of weird drama, art house, whatever they are. Kinky.
Duke of Burgundy.
Yeah, you know, whatever those movies are, but I love them all. And also a movie we've mentioned that we all like in this room, but not many people do, which is Better Watch Out. And I think that should be like a Christmas horror classic.
Yeah.
Why is it not yet?
Also,
it's sort of a dark Christmas movie, like Gremlins or something. It's
we haven't really talked about Jeremy Saulnier either.
No, we haven't.
Which is quite the oversight.
Green Room.
I have spoiler alert, I have a green room on my list, but we haven't talked about it in any other categories, have we?
Movie? And that's a debut, isn't it?
That's a
debut.
Blue Ruin's a debut, and Green Room came a couple of years or a year after.
Yeah,
so good.
Both stunning films.
Yeah. Okay, we've got one final category to cover, but first of all, let's hear a little contribution from friend of the pod, Lou Thomas. Lou, who I think sounds like he's on his way home from a night out when he recorded this. Here we go.
Yes, Mike. Evolution of horror, massive. Well, there's been an amazing decade of horror films. It's best to talk about some honourable mentions first, right? Obviously, you can't talk about horror without talking about Jordan Peele, because let's face it, both us and especially Get Out are two of the best films of the decade, genre-related or not, right? Also, Ari Aster, Hereditary for me is the big one. Midsommar is still pretty ace. Otherwise, the Babadook, yeah, clearly a massive film that was influential, in all sorts of different ways, as well as being, obviously a stand-up banging horror film. I also really loved It Follows, which kind of harks back to, John Carpenter and stuff. But all that said, there is one horror film for me that is above and beyond the rest, and some people wouldn't even class it as a horror film, but some people know nothing at all, and that has got to be Drew Goddard's The Cabin in the Woods, because it's basically the Evil Dead versus The Truman Show with a load of clever stuff thrown in. It subverts expectations and it's got an amazing ending. For me, it's not just best horror film of the decade, it's the best one of the best films of the decade, full stop. It's got a few scares and it's got a few tricks. For me, that's the big one. Later on, yeah.
Absolutely amazing. Okay, all right, and then finally, I want to ask you what's had the best writing, the best screenplay in a horror film?
Well, there's two ways to look at this. There's the screenplay, but it's not just dialogue. Anyone who really knows about screenplays, it's obviously structure and all of that. And all the structure in this film is wonderful, but I am choosing it for the dialogue. So I'm just going to say that up front. But I'm going for Lighthouse by Max and Robert Eggers.
I don't think you can have that.
I'm having it.
I'll tell you why you can't have that.
Let me tell you why.
Right,
let me tell you. I know what you're going to say, because it's coming out in January in the UK.
It's coming out in January, says I.
It's coming out in January in the UK. I admit it's coming out in January in the UK, but I saw it at Cannes in May. It's played festivals. It's played London Film Festival. Yeah. I'm bending the rules slightly.
Critic privilege.
But yeah, I come all the way here tonight. I'm having it.
Fair enough.
But Lighthouse, it's this kind of saucy, kind of piratical dialogue. It's all based on Herman Melville and all stuff like that. And it's just William Dafoe and Robert Pattinson really just getting drunk, dancing, just bantering, having a go at each other, and it's just wonderful.
Amazing.
You do like my lobster.
Yeah.
It's all like that. It's wonderful.
It's so authentic as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's amazing. Yeah. Rosie, what about you?
So there's a lot of obvious ones that we've mentioned. So Get Out obviously won the Oscar for Best Original Screenplay. It's a brilliant screenplay.
Yeah.
Is amazing. The Witch is brilliant and fascinating and multi-layered.
Which again
and
is
clever.
Robert and Max Eggers again, like the Lighthouse.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Creep is brilliant. I mean, there's not actually a lot that we haven't mentioned. I wanted to mention Shutter Island, actually. I thought Shutter Island was very good.
2010.
Yes.
You can have it.
Says I. Sorry, I will stop. I will stop doing
Everyone's talking about how The Irishman is his masterpiece. What about Shutter Island?
Well,
Come on.
I just think Shutter Island is an interesting... I just think it was an interesting screenplay. I just think
it really was.
It was a clever film, and
it was a lot cleverer than maybe meets the eye at the initially.
Well, I think it's a really emotional film.
It is.
But if I had to pick one, it would be Raw, because I just think Raw is so smart
wonderful.
and so complicated and so beautiful, and like Raw. So we talked a bit earlier about like upcoming
filmmakers,
and that's Julia Ducournau. Again, if I pronounced that wrong, forgive me. But that spoke to something in me very specifically that I haven't seen on film before, about this kind of idea of like female desire and female darkness, and I thought that was expressed so beautifully and so perfectly that would be my top choice.
She saw Texas Chainsaw Massacre when she was 6 years old.
There you go.
Throw that in there.
There you go. All of mine have been mentioned. Get Out would be my pick, really, because it's one of those movies where it's like every line means two things, and I love that about it. But I also love, what was the other one I was going to mention? I mean, obviously The Witch, again, like The Lighthouse, it has that kind of authenticity to it, where you kind of feel like you're listening to people actually, like I feel like I'm watching the actual 1600s or whatever.
But he goes back to transcripts and everything.
Yeah, his details. Yeah, and the other one is The Cabin in the Woods, again, because the cleverness, and again the kind of dual meanings, and everything is a throwback, or everything is in some way a kind of meta joke or a comment on the horror genre. Love that. Okay, I think we're pretty much done with our awards, so we're going to finish with our top 10 movies of the decade very shortly. Before we get into our top 10s, here are our last few voice messages from some EOH contributors.
Hi there, Dan Martin here, special effects artist and co-host of the Arrow Video podcast. I would have to say my favourite horror film of the last decade is The Borderlands, which I know sounds like a bit of a cheat because I worked on it, but honestly, I love that film so much. I've shown it to so many people over the years. The ending, watching them watch the ending is always an absolute delight. I think it's a near perfect horror film, and I love the reaction that it's got. I think a lot of people really, really love it. If I had to choose a picture that I hadn't worked on, it's going to be Green Room, a violent, tense, cathartic thriller horror. And in these modern times, who doesn't like seeing Nazis get shot in the face?
Hi Mike, it's Tim Coleman here. I think it's been a phenomenal decade for horror films and horror content in general, and there's so many films that we could pull out to talk about. If I think about the ones which have affected me the most over the last 10 years, it would be things like Adam Wingard's The Guest, or Shinichiro Ueda's One Cut of the Dead, right through to kind of films which people maybe don't always talk about as horror, but I would say absolutely are, like Laszlo Neam's Son of Saul, which is a really devastating Holocaust movie, or Darren Aronofsky's Black Swan, which again maybe got a lot of attention as an awards contender, but it's 100% like it's a body horror psychological film, and really affecting. In terms of the top spot, I think it would have to go to two films, one from the first half of the decade and one from the second. So it would be, for me, Jennifer Kent's The Babadook and Issa Lopez's Tigers Are Not Afraid, which both kind of interrogate and analyse these kind of social constructions of motherhood and mental health and childhood, and really play around in this ideas of surviving trauma and recovery. I think they're absolutely fantastic pieces of work, and I think it also illustrates that it's been an incredible decade for female horror filmmakers as well. So I would go with those two. All right, well, Merry Christmas to you, mate, and speak to you soon. All right, bye.
All right, we're going to finish then. We don't have to spend too long on these, but we can run through our top 10s, because most of them we've probably already discussed. Rosie, let's start with your top 10.
Okay, so I've just written a list of films and I haven't put it in order.
Fine.
And there's more than 10. But so
here we are, 2 hours later. Number 228.
It's kind of a bit rich of me to say you can't have a 2020 movie.
You're going to have one, aren't you?
So they're not top and there's not 10.
But other than that, here's your top.
Okay, so here is a bunch of things that I wanted to make sure that got a mention, and most of them did. So I'm just going to say what they are, and I'm not going to bother banging on about them.
Nice, okay.
And probably Hereditary's number one, by the way. Anyway, The Endless, already banged on about. Hereditary, what a movie. Innkeepers, terrifying. Creep, already mentioned, excellent. The Last Exorcism, we haven't talked about. I don't like the very end of it, but I really thought it was a great movie up until that point.
Yes.
Killing of a Sacred Deer, we mentioned briefly, but wow, what a movie that is.
We've not mentioned Yorgos Lanthimos, but yeah, amazing.
Oh yes, oh my god, yeah. But that one particularly, and there's so much going on with that, and that's one of those very harrowing films.
Agreed.
Cheap Thrills I thought was really, really good.
Yes.
Rabies I've mentioned. Excision, yes. Under the Skin, we've ticked off. Cabin in the Woods. A Quiet Place we haven't really gone into, but I thought that was really good.
Great monster movie. Yeah, monsters, great monster movie.
Obviously the massive plot hole, but everyone's talked about that to death. But very emotional movie. I found it very...
I find the score annoying in that film.
A bit too...
Because it's A Quiet Place. There's hardly any dialogue. They're whispering. I think he missed a trick, but if he'd had the balls to have no score as well, it would have really been something.
Do you know what? I'm going to weirdly disagree with you on that.
Okay.
Because one of the things I liked about it is how it subverted what horror does with a score. So what horror often does, and I'm not all horror, but let's say like Conjuring universe, is quiet, piano.
Yeah.
And this goes piano, quiet. And when it's quiet, you're fucked.
Yeah.
When it's piano, everything's fine. And then
it goes quiet.
When it goes quiet, you're not okay. And I just thought that was quite an interesting use of stuff. So then, What We Do in the Shadows we haven't talked about, which is criminal because that movie is absolutely brilliant.
And we didn't talk about it on TV horror as well.
Oh no, that's really good, isn't it?
Because the first series of that is fantastic.
I
gets
think I liked
better.
It more than the
film. I did.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't.
Oh, I did.
I missed Taika.
I think it took a couple of episodes to get going, but by about 3 or 4, when it found its own groove, it was amazing.
Although, didn't you think the emotional vampire was a one? It was a gag.
It was, but I found it funny start to finish.
But the film.
He reminded me of me a bit. Actually, just the grumpy old sucking the soul out of everything.
I don't know, and the film is so quotable with the leave me alone to do my dark bidding on the internet.
Yeah.
What are you bidding on? A table. It's just brilliant. And that film really deserves some respect.
It does.
The Ritual, which we've mentioned. Detention, which we haven't mentioned.
Oh my God, yeah.
And
I didn't like it.
Yeah, you and me, we've talked about this.
Yep.
And I can see why.
Irritated the hell out of me.
Yeah. I'm with Jamie on this. I found it the most irritating film.
I totally get that, and I think
loads of people loved it. Loads.
I think you either are with it and love it, or find it mind-blowingly annoying. And I loved it.
Yeah, I so wish I saw that. So many people seeing it, because everyone told me how brilliant it is. Yeah,
it's my drunk movie basically. It's the movie when people come around my house after the pub or whatever, and I'm like, let's put this on, and they're like, this is annoying, turn it off. No, watch it. I love Detention and 10 Cloverfield Lane. So sorry for cheating.
I can't believe I completely forgot about 10 Cloverfield Lane. Yeah. All right, Jamie, I imagine you've got an actual top 10.
Right, I have got an actual top 10, but before I begin on my top 10,
here we go.
I've just got to name a few close but no cigars, because it's criminal that movies this good can't get in a top 10. It just kills me, honestly. So not in my top 10, but so close. Barbarian Sound Studio, Under the Shadow, Fashionista, Mandy, It Follows, Climax, A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, Over Your Dead Body, which is Takashi Miike, one of my favourite films of his since Audition, Enemy, The Battery, A Night of Nightmares, The Babadook. I could keep going, but I'm going to stop there and do my top 10. So my top 10 in reverse order, just to make it as dramatic as possible.
Good, I like it.
So number 10 is Hounds of Love. Very, very disturbing. Number 9, because it's so elegant and beautiful and such a lovely screenplay. Talk of screenplays, The Witch in the Window.
Oh, loved that.
Don't know if you
loved
saw
that.
but,
Loved it. Terrified
so
me.
warm and moving,
creepy,
and
though.
chilling all at once. It's fantastic. Tiny little film, 73 minutes long. I urge people to go and see that. Number 8, Hereditary, has to be in there. Number 7, The Witch. We've talked about it endlessly. Number 6, Under the Skin. Number 5, Rosie's going to go absolutely fucking... No, you're going to go fucking mental at this, because it's not out yet. It's coming out in February in the UK on Eureka Video, bringing it out on Blu-ray. But Bliss by Joe Bagos, which was at Fright Fest this year. So I'm counting it because I saw it in Fright Fest. But it's a bit like Gaspar Noé, but it's just a crazy trip.
This is the Vampires on LSD.
Vampire LSD is kind of a movie about addiction, about art. It's a bit like The Phantom Thread if Abel Ferrara made it. It's absolutely brilliant. Complete head trip. Number 4, The Lighthouse. So another one.
Unbelievable.
I'm so sorry, but I'm having it. Number 3, Snowtown, which I've talked about endlessly tonight. Number 2, Kill List, and number 1, the big one, Midsummer.
Oh, Midsummer
is my number 1.
It's good to see some love for Midsummer.
I absolutely, well, obviously I do it because it's my number 1.
Do you know what? Hearing your list, can I just say my list is quite bad. I probably should have put some of those ones in.
Your list is
brilliant.
No, it's fantastic. It's better to get a whole load of people listening to this. If you haven't seen any, just go and get
Under
them
the
all.
Skin and Snowtown
Everything
should be, and so should the Babadook.
Yeah,
but of course. But also some of those movies, especially the Babadook, for example, go without saying almost. We all love the Babadook. I mean, it is on my list, but yeah.
Go on, Mike, this is a big one.
All right, go on then. Mine are all... Actually, there's one maybe that we haven't talked about, but that's it. The rest I'll rattle through. My number 10 is Black Swan. I love Black Swan. Yeah. Number 9, Hereditary. Number 8, Green Room. Right. Jeremy Saulnier's Green Room, which I didn't even know was going to be a horror film really going into it. And I was more... It reminded me of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre or something. This kind of like people going to the middle of nowhere and being stuck in that situation, and the dogs and the gore and the arm getting hacked off and all of it's amazing. I loved it. Kill List, I feel like we've not really given enough love to Ben Wheatley, but Kill List is incredible. The Babadook is my number 6. My number 5 is The Invitation, Karen Kusama's The Invitation, which I loved.
I almost mentioned that on Screenplay because that is a film where every line of dialogue it just hangs there and it's so awkward. You're just at that dinner party and it's just it's horrendous.
In the same way that some of Ari Aster's movies are so awkward and scary just in a real life way, the same with The Invitation for me, where it really I was like tense from the get-go.
Even if it had turned out that nothing was at odds and there was no weirdness, horror, supernatural, whatever stuff going on, just that social awkwardness.
The tension and why are they locking the door, what's going on here, everything about the kind of background info that you know about them, all the way up until that last shot where you see the red lanterns. I just love it. It chills me to the bone. Number 4, Under the Skin, loved it. Number 3, The Witch, which is probably I think the scariest film I've seen of the decade. Number 2, The Cabin in the Woods, amazing.
I love that.
And my number one, really obvious bit, is Get Out. I think it's like a masterpiece,
Yeah.
the most important film of the decade for me. I think it's, a milestone.
Yeah.
So there we go. Amazing. And the last question I want to ask you guys, it might not necessarily be your personal favourite, but I wanted to ask you off the back of me just saying that about Get Out, which is my answer to this. But what do you think is the most important horror film of the decade? What's going to be the horror film that people remember this decade by, do you think, if there's one?
It's not in my top 10, but I do rate it highly as Get Out. I agree with you. Partly because it was made for $4.5 million. It did incredible business, something like $255 million or something mad. It got Oscar nominations, so it broke horror out of a ghetto for that. Obviously, in terms of what it's doing politically, with a sort of liberal kind of, all of that stuff. It's just such a on the money movie about right here, right now, the kind of current in America right now and across Europe, and just with everything going on. So I think that is the one that people will remember this decade for, probably.
Love it. Rosie?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you.
Yeah.
I think that when people talk about horror this decade, so I think that as a film, Get Out, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I think it may possibly be remembered as, it's not really a horror, it's a social thriller.
Yeah, you're so right.
But in pure, it's a horror. I think The Conjuring will be, when people talk about the 2010s, they'll go, oh yeah, that was the Conjuring universe. And I mean, I quite like The Conjuring, like we've talked about, I prefer Conjuring 2, but those films were quite important. But I also I think It is a very interesting case because It was treated differently to most horror movies in that it was treated like a blockbuster movie. It wasn't treated like a horror movie or a genre movie. It was treated like a blockbuster. So you had trailers, several trailers and teaser trailers.
Trailers for when trailers were going to drop.
Yeah,
and stuff.
which you don't tend to have with horror movies. And there were events, and the cast and director were kind of taken around, and they were on like Graham Norton and all these kinds of things. It had... Like it was screened really early. It's long, and it became the most financially successful horror movie of all time.
700 and something.
Yeah,
it's true. Yeah, we can't really ignore that it's become the most successful of all time.
Well, it has, and so I think that I don't know what impact that will have, but I think it'll have an impact because I think what Warner Brothers is doing is recognizing that horror is big business. It's not just this little thing going on in the corner that,
and also,
like the kind of freaks and weirdos like. It's like actually people like horror, and so I think we will see some repercussions from that going on decades.
And also, I don't think we've had a horror movie, especially if you count both halves of it, we haven't had a horror movie made on that scale, that scope, that kind of blockbuster as you're talking, since The Shining, since 1980, when Kubrick had a year to shoot it, being Stanley Kubrick, and the money and all of that, and that just the grandiosity of it. I don't think we've had that since.
Right, and of course, like The Shining having Nicholson.
Yes.
But of course, It having Jessica Chastain, Oscar nominee Jessica Chastain, having
James
McAvoy, Bill Hader. Like, it's got a starry cast that probably wouldn't have signed on for It 2 were it not for It 1 being treated so well, but also doing so, being so incredibly successful. So I might be wrong, but I can imagine a world where other studios are going ding 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 ding, hang on a minute, we've got the Jason Blum model, which is amazing and I'm all for, but now we've got another model,
we've got this other thing,
and Marvel Cinematic Universe and Conjuring Universe make loads of money, and maybe that's the thing.
Stephen King. Well, I mean, I'm sure it's no coincidence that since the success of It Chapter 1, we've had I think 4 Stephen King adaptations this year, haven't we, in this last year and everything, so it's definitely
but that's been going on for ages, but like In the Tall Grass, not very good.
Not very good at all.
But it's how they're treated, because like Dr. Sleep was also treated like a blockbuster. But The Dark Tower, what a big old mess that was.
Yeah, that's true.
So it might well be Warner Brothers looking at the properties they've got and going, okay, if we're going to do an adaptation of, I don't know, I can't think of a good example, but a new King movie, going, hang on a minute, no, we're going to get in the big guns and we're going to throw money at this and we're going to make sure this is absolute gold.
Yeah,
because there's a lot in the pipeline, Stephen King. There's at least sort of 10 being made right now or in pre-production, probably more, and some big hitters as well, like The Stand, stuff like that. So that is a big business that is not going away.
There we go. Amazing. Another 10 years to look forward to. Guys, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Thank you. And there we have it. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you once again to my brilliant guests, Rosie Fletcher and Jamie Graham. What an incredible decade of horror it's been. I'd love to hear from you guys. Please do send in your feedback. What have been your favourite horror movies of the decade? Are there any that we missed out? I'm sure there must be ones that we didn't mention. It's impossible to cover them all, but we'd love to hear some of your picks and suggestions. Please do get in touch. The email address is evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, Letterboxd and Instagram. You can also discuss the episode and the horror genre in general with fellow listeners in the Evolution of Horror discussion group. You can find that on Facebook. And don't forget, if you want to support this podcast and be treated to weekly bonus episodes, you only need to sign up to our Patreon channel and donate $5 per month. Go over to patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. We've had a whole bunch of really interesting bonus episodes in the last couple of weeks. We reviewed the new Black Christmas. We brought you a special Jason X episode on Friday the 13th a couple of weeks ago, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff. Head on over there and you can check out the entire archive of bonus episodes. That's patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. You can find all other episodes of this podcast on our website. Simply go to evolutionofhorror.com, and you can subscribe to this podcast on all the usual podcast platforms. If you get a spare minute, please do drop us a little rating or review, particularly on Apple Podcasts if you are an Apple Podcast user. That really helps us get boosted in algorithms, which helps us get discovered by new listeners. Okay, next week, normal service will resume. We're going to begin January 2020 with part 10 of our occult series. And what a way to kick off a new year and a new decade. We're going to be looking back at William Friedkin's The Exorcist from 1973. In the second half of the episode, you're going to hear the live discussion that we did on stage in front of an audience, in which we discussed the movie in depth following a screening of it in London. But in the first half of the episode, you're going to hear my discussion with the guy, the expert in all things Exorcist. It is, of course, Mark Kermode. So join us next week for all of this and more on the Evolution of Horror.